and particularly since the participants or the presenters for the first part is already on the platform. Let me once again apologize to all the participants for what just transpired. I think we must take the advice of the deputy speaker to use. There is a locally developed platform of the same nature. I think we need to find out more about it so that we begin to use locally developed products and possibly curb the possibility of what is happening to happen today. I'm really very happy with the support and the patience from our participants. And once more, let me just apologize for something that we don't know what it is that happened now. So we will continue with the program. I don't think we can go back and start from scratch. So in continuing with our program, we will now call on the Deputy Speaker to the Honorable Lechisa Tsenodi to make his input. Honorable Tsenodi, welcome, my colleague. So if you can just enlighten us on the importance of policy review, particularly in the context of the COVID-19 development. Over to you, Honorable Tsenodi.
Thank you very much, Madam Chairperson, Deputy Chairperson. I appreciate the opportunity to speak. Let me just say this, that when you build a house, it takes a bit of time, 2 to 3 rainy seasons. Firstly, to see where the leak is when it rains, and then for you to attend to it and close it. But it takes the next season to recognize whether that leak was well done or not, because otherwise you won't be able to know until it rains again to see that it's no longer leaking, the safety measures put in are in place. Similarly, our work on the hybrid platform and using virtual platforms as we do here requires of us to do that. This is not the first time this thing happens. We have put in systems in place to try and protect us, but clearly they were not effective. But this is an important experience on which we will build to ensure we put up better security system to prevent the bombing such as has just happened. But that's the nature of life. And I would like to start by also welcoming this opportunity for us to have this high-level discussion on a very important subject. I want to start by suggesting that perhaps we should start at the beginning, in quotes, not too far back, but just to say that historically, the development of the Charter was given rise to by the lived experiences of women and men and gender activists, broadly speaking, on the ground. Those lived experiences suggested that in order to deal with the problems effectively, we needed a way of handling that is agreed to and so on. So the first charter that gave rise to the second charter in 1994 was given rise to for the same reasons and so on. So the review that we undertook recently was also in a sense informed by those concrete lived realities of women and girl children, of men and boys in a society that is divided as ours is and continues to be. I thought that's an important point to raise, that and that includes the constitution that we in South Africa chose to put together and to frame it such that it gives amongst, in fact, as a priority, the building of a non-racial, non-sexist, democratic society that is prosperous and hopefully, in my wish, that is egalitarian, so that we have enough for everybody in our country, and we continue to ensure that we do that. That vision, which we are all engaged in building towards, It's an important reason for the work we are doing here, that we would like to measure progress towards achieving an unracial, an unsexist, and democratic society. Those are important overall objectives to which we are working. Now, the concrete policies that we then shape, that is informed by the Constitution and its Bill of Rights, for example, and the injunction to us in our peculiar conditions in South Africa to heal the past in particular ways, are crucial measures that are in the Constitution and informs the measures that we should take. And so the policy and legislative steps that we then subsequently take after looking at the Constitution and where it says we should be moving towards and what to aim for are important steps. I want to suggest that in addition to that, this process we are talking about also takes place in an unequal power relations globally. So the dominant in society globally do what they want, what they please, because they have power and they can enforce it in a number of ways that others will not be able to do so. So those unequal power relations are reasons we should be engaging in this conversation, so that what we put into place is constantly reviewed to measure the progress and the impact it ought to be making. For example, the regular annual trip to New York to report on progress made with the equality provisions and the gender equality that we aspire to are important platforms internationally to do that, including in the associations that we belong to as Parliament, in this instance, the Interparliamentary Union, as well as the Commonwealth Parliamentary Associations, which insist we should be looking at these. So the experiences we have had internationally suggest that when we are able to come together, we recognize the influences of the power relations in society, the continuing patriarchal systems that remain in place because of the unequal and the imbalance that exists in society. So the necessity for us to collaborate across our boundaries, country boundaries and other boundaries is important, is the foundation for the few steps that we want to take that must inform making quicker progress when we take to account those practical experiences in other countries, so that we are not blinded by our own limitation of experience, not to see possibilities and opportunities that others have already seen. We can adapt them usefully to our own experiences without mimicking them. So that's an important platform, this being international, if I may put it that way. And of course, there's no question that when, as the Speakers Forum, the Parliament in the 9 provinces, to examine post-94 legislation, we sought to understand why, having created the Constitution that suggested the legislation that we have so far passed, and some constitutional decisions taken, for example, to correct us, why are we not having the impact we expected we would have? Is it because of policies that we put into place? Are there gaps in policies? But most importantly, the shifting conditions in society. In our case, we can talk about our original intention to lift the majority of people from poverty and from exploitation and from discrimination of all sorts and so on. And so why are we not having the impact that we desire to have? What are the shifts that are taking place that require of us perhaps to look afresh at the policy and perhaps at the legislative steps we should take? And that's a very crucial part of what I think we learned through the high-level panel that examine post-94 legislation, that there are certain weaknesses about the content and the formulation of the legislation itself, the process that was undertaken, but also the institutions that we created to then help us implement the legislation, that we are not making the impact necessarily that we're having. To conclude by making reference to our experience in conducting this 2-year review of the Women's Charter, those conversations with districts and then subsequently with the provincial leadership in each of the provinces where we had this 4 or 5 districts per province, were very interesting in how sharply, whilst we were concerned with reviewing a policy framework, what people were concerned about largely was the practical experiences they were having as we spoke. In other words, their lived experience as we spoke and thought about how we frame what we should aim to ultimately achieve. Their worry correctly was about what we can do today to change things and do it more effectively. So the relationship between the different spheres of government that came out of the conversations was very clear in how it constitutes an important area, both not only of policy, but of examining implementation, monitoring and evaluation effectively to take urgent steps to correct things. So I thought I should limit my remarks to those, but having framed it that way, that the historical lived experiences that gave rise to the Charter and its review are crucial pointers to why we must never ignore the reality of the past in the way in which it provides opportunities for doing things, including inspiration for what we should continue to do. And the practical experiences today that we have reflected, they also do the same. In other words, they put pressure on us to do things faster because of the urgency that people during the review process spoke about. That urgency is what should characterize how we do our work. And properly framed policies will make things work better. So that, as an example, the financing, the funding, where this is appropriate, but the relationships amongst people, both public and private and community, there must not be legislative obstacles to such relationship forming and operating together to bring about the best outcomes. Thank you very much, Deputy Chair. I hope the remarks we have made goes some way to showing some small light on where we should be headed to. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Deputy Speaker. You must just remember, you are going to be our lecturer on gender equality and gender equal policies. So yesterday we attended a site event of the CSW 66 arranged by the IPU. And the reason why they had that event was that yesterday was 10 years since the IPU developed a program of action for gender equal parliaments. And our Women's Charter, and particularly the review of the Women's Charter, became a very important instrument to measure what progress we have made in South Africa with regards to gender equality. But I should say, if you just Google on gender equality in general, you will find that South Africa is one of the countries that is highly commended. It comes highly commended for the progress that we have made with regards to gender equality, particularly in areas like in the legislatures and wherever we have done that. So I just want to say your efforts is not in vain. That is what I want to say to all of us. That was part and parcel of the processes. And at this moment, we will now call on the Commission of Gender Equality, the chairperson, Ms. Tamara Mategula, to continue to give us a perspective on the national policy framework on gender. So I will now call on Ms. Tamara Matebula, CGE, our partner, a very important partner in the process of the Women's Charter Review.
Thank you very much, Chairperson. Just to check if I'm audible. Am I audible?
You are indeed.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you, Program Director, Deputy Chairperson, Honorable Lucas, Deputy Speaker, Honorable Sinodi, Honorable Chair Masondo, Honorable Chairpersons of the Multi-Party Women's Caucus, Honorable Speakers of the Provincial Legislatures, fellow Chapter 9 and 10 institutions, representatives, the UNDP country representative, Dr. Odusula, representatives of the civil society organizations, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for inviting us. My brief was to provide an overview on key tenets of the National Gender Policy Framework, NGPF, in short, assessing its efficacy towards realization of the South African, the concrete recommendations of the amendment of the NGPF. With your permission, Chair, I would like to switch off my video so that I can go straight into my presentation.
You may continue.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you very much. Thanks a lot. Chairperson, the Commission for Gender Equality has been invited to actually come and share, with you today. And I want to say that in terms of presentation outline, the Commission will quickly go through the mandate. I will then cover the introduction, do the background very quickly, talk about the national gender machinery, and then come to the recommendations that we'll be looking at both the provincial gender machinery mechanisms and gender focal persons. So I think my recommendations will revolve around these. Thank you, Chair. Next slide, please. Quickly, Chair, without waste of time, I just want to say that as all we know that the Commission for Gender Equality was established in terms of the Constitution of the Republic of South Africa, as well as the CGE Act that gives us powers and mandate to promote gender equality in South Africa. And we are one of the 6 institutions that are supporting constitutional democracy, and we are promoting gender equality in the Republic of South Africa. So the Commission is committed to creating a society that is free from gender discrimination, and a society where people shall have the opportunities and means to realize their potential regardless of gender, race, class, religion, disability, and geographic areas. And just moving away from the mandate, Chair, I just want to also just say that part of our mandate is to monitor, evaluate, and make necessary recommendations to Parliament and to our stakeholders. And we do this through making sure that we influence policy, we influence practice, we influence policy and practice of organs of state, statutory bodies, and functionaries, public bodies, private as well as civil society sector to promote gender equality. And we do this in terms of looking at existing laws, including indigenous laws and practices, and we actually make contributions there. And we also make sure that with regards to implementation of regional as well as international laws, because South Africa is a signatory and has acceded to these, we also do have a contribution in terms of influencing at those levels. So the CGE has to propose and recommend new laws that will impact positively on gender equality and improve the status of women, and liaise and interact with institutions and bodies or authorities with similar objectives. In terms of the background, Chair, I just want to continue and give a little bit of a background or introduction that talks about the Commission for Gender Equality in line with the constitutional mandate carried out. So we did an assessment on the effectiveness and the status of the national as well as the provincial gender machinery, and looking at mechanisms of this machinery in South Africa. So the Commission for Gender Equality started this work in 2011, and we engaged with a number of projects geared towards gaining a deeper understanding on the state of the national gender machinery as underpinned by the provisions of the National Gender Policy Framework for Women and Empowerment and Gender Equality of 2000. So the Commission had published a research report titled Assessing the Effectiveness of Gender Focal Points in South Africa, and this report was published in 2013, and a policy brief that we have internally was titled Turning Events Management into Gender Focal Person, Assessing Effectiveness of Gender Focal Persons in the Public Service. And these policy briefs were released in 2014, Honorable Chair. In terms of the internal discussions that we had within CGE with regards to these policy briefs, we looked at the evaluation of the effectiveness of the national gender machinery in South Africa, which also existed since 2013, as well as internal discussion documents on assessing the effectiveness and status of the provincial gender machinery. Again, I think in terms of background, Chair, we would remember that South African National Policy Framework for Women's Empowerment and Gender Equality, in short, NGPF, outlines the national gender machinery as a web of institution that supports gender equality in South Africa. So collectively, the role of these institutions in this web is to promote and protect gender equality in South Africa. So these institutions are located and they are at different tiers of government. So you will see that in the executives, we have the Ministry of Women then, but now it's called Ministry of Women, Youth and Persons with Disabilities. In the legislature, we have the Multi-Party Women's Caucus, the Women's Empowerment Unit in the Office of the Speaker, the Portfolio Committee on Women, Youth and Persons with Disabilities, and selected committees on women, youth and persons with disabilities. And in the public service, Honorable Deputy Chair, there are gender desks. Many have closed down, and there is a Chapter 9 body, which is an autonomous statutory body called the Commission for Gender Equality. And these are also gender desks and at provincial level, mainly located within the Office of the Premier. And this was adapted and adopted by the CSW in 2000. And it is the current official policy framework that guides gender implementation in South Africa. In terms of the background, again, you will remember, Chair, that the creation of the national gender machinery was embraced in Africa and South Africa as well after the 1985 UN Decade for Women Conference in Nairobi, Kenya. And one of the main aspects of the Nairobi Platform of Action was the institutionalization of gender machinery. So in 1995, Beijing Platform of Action reinforced the importance and urgency of establishing these structures, as well as mainstreaming gender across all departments. So gender mainstreaming was officially adopted by the United Nations member states, and South Africa, being part of those member states of the Beijing conference, followed suit. So it was adopted as a strategy as part of domesticating this, and also as part of accelerating the advancement of women and the realization of women's human rights in South Africa. So further committing itself to the implementation of gender mainstreaming as one of the national commitments, through which the implementation of the gender mainstreaming and the Beijing Gender Platform for Action of 1996 was to be realized. Chair, if you look at the national gender machinery very quickly, there have been some challenges, but despite the existence of the elaborate national gender machinery structure, realignment to fit women, youth and persons with disability, and the national, regional, as well as global policy frameworks for promoting attainment of gender equality. So there is a general consensus, Deputy Chair, that gender equality and transformation should continue to face intractable obstacles. So it has become clear that the national gender machinery structures in South Africa have actually suffered some kind of challenges, and these challenges emanate from insufficient budgetary resources, lack of clarity of purpose, poor role of functional definitions, as well as duplication of mandates and responsibilities, as well as accountability. So one of the recurring challenges, Chair, with the gender NGF and NGM is the overlapping mandates that often cause confusion, in particular the issues of overlapping mandates when you look at the Department of Women, Youth and Persons with Disabilities and the mandate of the Commission for Gender Equality. And these mandates should actually be clearly defined in the CGE Act as well as the Constitution of the Republic of South Africa. Chair, without waste of time, we have recommendations that we would like to share with the body, and I will not waste time, but actually go to key highlights of the recommendations that we bring forth to this meeting. The first one being the crucial or the importance of the national gender machinery as a collective to review and redefine its institutional identity, and also look at the role, the functions, and the responsibilities of those web institutions towards gender mainstreaming as well as transformation. And it's important that the individual institutions also review clarity and re-articulate their individual mandates, their roles, their responsibilities to eliminate duplication and overlapping mandates. So in earnest, Chair, what I'm saying here is that there needs to be a review of the national gender machinery in South Africa, including the review of those individual institutions to understand individual mandates and responsibilities. Secondly, Chair, it is recommended that a common national monitoring and a validly defined indicators to measure our outcomes, to measure our impact, and this should be utilized by the national gender machinery structures, as well as newly gendered national development plan going forward. So the lack of a coordination of the work of the national gender machinery structure is critical, Chair, and we have realized that there is lack of coordinating structures that continue to undermine the effectiveness in promoting gender mainstreaming in South Africa. So it is crucial that the issue is given urgent consideration with the aim of identifying a lead institution, Honorable Deputy Chair, with a necessary resources institutional capacity, and the work of the sector, and convening regular sectoral meetings to review progress towards the goal of gender mainstreaming and challenges that are faced. So, Chair, here I want to emphasize on the lack of coordination, and we are recommending that there should be a coordinating structure and identification of an institution that will actually do that work. Chair, if you look at what's happening in provinces in terms of provincial or further recommendations, I think the issue of lack of resources, the financial, budgetary, human capacity, expertise, access to information, and all of that is one of the key factors undermining the effectiveness and institutional capacity of the NGM to play a meaningful role in the promotion of gender equality and transformation in South Africa. So, Chair, the recommendation here is that it is vital that we provide necessary resources to enhance the capacity of the NGM structures and to promote gender mainstreaming and transformation. And this is a concrete recommendation. And here, Chair, we also recommend that there should be an earmarked fund or concrete fundraising strategy for the NGM as a collective. And this fundraising should actually be developed as a matter of urgency, Chair, because we have realized that these institutions do lack funding at some point. So these budgetary constraints are limiting in terms of doing the work of the NGM. Finally, the relationship between the formal statutory NGM structures and independent civil society institutions need to be reviewed and clarified to ensure effective partnerships that should benefit the sector in general in terms of harnessing the resources of all the role players towards achieving the goal of gender equality and transformation. Chair, the emphasis here is that we need a multi-sectoral approach, government, civil society together, and also strengthening the civil society organizations' mandate of holding government into account so that the civil society can also be watchdogs in as so far as implementation is concerned. Chair, quickly, without waste of time, the last few slides are just looking at provincial gender machinery. Chair, you will remember that provinces from the OSW, provinces through the Office of the Premier were then given a mandate to establish NGMs. And Chair, I must say that out of 9 provinces, only 7 provinces are still having this function. And I must also mention that both Gauteng and Western Cape had a different model that they adopted, Chair, in terms of aligning to the guidelines of the NGPF 2000. So, Chair, the responsibility of the coordinating structure that we are talking about should see to it that there is alignment, there is harmonization to a framework by all structures and provinces. And I won't waste time, Chair. I think I will come back and make emphasis on this one. So in general, the observation that the Commission for Gender Equality had, Chair, was that there is no alignment in different provinces. And in provinces, Chair, all provinces did not have an articulated theory of change embedded on women's empowerment principles and gender equality prescripts. So we are also saying that the provincial gender machineries should not be areas where campaigns and celebrations and commemorations are done, especially when we have the National Women's Month, the 16 days of activism, but we must have programs that cut across throughout the year. So most provinces have special programs, and these programs should appear in their plans, annual plans, and in their strategic frameworks or national strategic plans, Chair. And Chair, just to the next one, another provincial gender machinery in terms of lack of coordination, lack of standardization, lack of staffing and recruitment guidelines were not there. So I think we were recruiting willy-nilly, and varying job level placements were done. And these were challenges, Chair, in terms of staffing for all the provincial gender machineries. So some of these challenges can be associated with the lack of mechanisms to institutionalize gender through the provincial growth and development strategy and at the provincial level. So out of 9 provinces sampled, Chair, we also realized that there were different responsive planning, budgeting, monitoring, and evaluation and gender auditing frameworks that were adopted at that level. Towards final slides, Chair, I also want to emphasize that CGE here recommends that there should be a coordination and standardization at provincial level. So the Office of the Status of Women at provincial levels, Chair, should appoint a gender focal person in a standardized format and at a senior level. So there is a need to review the appointments at this level, Chair, and there should be intensive capacity building programs on gender mainstreaming for the provincial gender machineries and administration, so that they are also aligned to what the provincial strategies are saying. Let me skip through that, Chair. And I think part of the planning and budgeting should also include or should factor the importance of making sure that we realize what the provincial growth and development strategies are saying, and we align with these in terms of our gender machinery in provinces. The next one, Chair, is that in terms of oversight, accountability, and legislation, the Office of the Premier, of the Premiers, who are seen to be the main coordinators or coordinating centers, should make sure that sources of policies and support at that level, providing support for all provincial departments should be done, and we should strengthen coordination at that level and make sure that the Office of the Premier holds all the provincial government departments into account for gender mainstreaming in provinces. So provincial legislature are constitutionally mandated to exercise oversight and the functioning of government, including performance with regards to policies and plans through standing committees on the quality of life or quality for life for women, youth, and persons with disabilities. And these are the functions of provinces and provincial legislature. And Chair, the civil society should also play a crucial role in holding government into account, and they should be involved in the PGMs, making inputs at that level, but also making sure that they play an oversight role and holding government accountable chairperson. So in terms of institutional support, the institutions that are supporting constitutional democracy should hold everyone into account. So the CGE would play a role in articulating the NGP and the National Gender Policy Framework, and it should also provide oversight to government, civil society, and everyone else. And there is an urgent need, Chair, to review the National Gender Policy Framework of 2000. I must really emphasize this, and there should be alignment and harmonization with the National Development Plan Vision 2030, the Sustainable Development Goals, especially Goal number 5, and the AU Agenda 2063 and other international and regional gender frameworks like the Maputo Protocol. Chair, I also want to emphasize the skilling, the importance of skilling the gender focal persons, elevating them to a level where they can make decisions, giving them funding where they can actually have their budgets. And towards the end, Chair, I want to also say that the gender focal persons should actually have a mandate in terms of making sure that they input into the policy guidelines at a provincial level. And the last slide, Chair, that I want to share with you is that the recommendation national and local authorities and other relevant institutions should undertake a thorough review of their gender mainstreaming institutional arrangements, including internal processes and procedures for recruiting officials responsible for these activities. So it is necessary for senior management in the government departments to be thoroughly familiar with what the NGB and NGPF is requiring. And I think, Chair, what is important here is to make sure that as we make appointments, we look at competencies and functions, and we look at other crucial aspects of the post-GPF requirements. So it would be important to ensure that we afford conditions appropriate for the effective implementation of gender mainstreaming policies at all levels. And we strongly recommend that government departments, local authorities, institutions, government with positions of GPF already in place should undertake a thorough review and evaluate the post effect and its related responsibilities to determine the scope of responsibilities necessary to ensure effective and efficient gender mainstreaming at all levels. There, I want to pause here and thank you very much for inviting the Commission for Gender Equality. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Chairperson of the Commission on Gender Equality. And I also just want to mention one thing that I appreciate about this presentation is that the consistency on the issues that you have consistently raised to confirm the issues that is not happening, but also as to how we can improve on our gender equality implementation. If we can just look into the standardization, the coordination, the resourcing, particularly human and financial, in our different departments or within government. And we really hope the National Strategic Plan and the implementation thereof will lead us to a better dispensation. Thank you very much. Commissioner Peko would have been the next one, but she's not yet available. So we will now call on Dr. Ayodele Odusula, our UNDP resident representative, one of our partners, also very consistent. And we really want to also appreciate him and his body. And we will call on him to continue with the presentation on policy analysis. Dr. Odusula.
Thank you, Madam Program Director. I really appreciate the previous discussions and also to really acknowledge the Deputy Chairperson, National Council of Province, the Chairperson, Multi-Party Women Caucus, the Speakers of Provincial Legislature, honorable members, members of the Chapter 9 institutions that are here today, invited guests, speakers, and all protocols observed. Madam Program Director, thank you for the invitation, and we really appreciate the role of the National Parliament in pushing for the frontier of concrete development outcomes in South Africa. And I just want to really underscore the importance of the Parliament in any development landscape in any country, be it developed or developing. And you are really bringing this to the level of discussion that will help us to really appreciate the role of gender equality in development management. Let me just start by looking at the imperatives of gender policies, which I strongly believe, and also I'm speaking on behalf of the United Nations system that are operating in Ceravica, and also particularly as the institution that I'm heading, United Nations Development Program. We really acknowledge being invited into this particular event. Starting with the imperative of gender policy frameworks, which I strongly believe it's a good starting point. And Ceravica is known to be one of the very few countries globally that have the level of institutions that are formidable to really promote inclusive development. And the issue of policies relating to gender equality and women empowerment is really key. And that's why it is very important for us to have gender policy frameworks and mechanisms in place. First, as a means of measurement, because in developing countries, what is not measured and documented does not get implemented. This gender policy framework provides opportunity for us to translate things into implementation mode. It also really serves as an instrument for operationalizing leaving no one behind of the National Development Plan, as well as the Sustainable Development Goals of the United Nations system, and the Africa we want of the African Union Agenda 2063. And in particular, it is a good instrument for implementing inclusive development, reaching the marginalized women, girls, and youths in our society. So this is something we see to be very important. And as we all know, South Africa has been rated very well in a number of areas pertaining to gender instruments. And there has been a number of progress the country has made when it comes to the issue of gender policy framework. And has been shared by the, Mrs. Matubela, which is really, really a groundbreaking in terms of the depth of what has been done so far. South Africa has made giant stride in terms of politics and leadership, particularly the more women are in leadership positions, either national, provincial, and municipalities. Women in parliament, which we all know rose from about 28% in 1994 to 45% in 2009, and also achieving one of the very few countries in the world that achieve 50-50% in terms of gender balance in national cabinets. It's only very few countries that have been able to achieve this globally. And also when it comes to the issue of education, there are so many things that have been mentioned, that have been achieved. And I want to underscore the gender parity in primary schools, which is a novel thing. It's been achieved for quite some time, more than 7 years ago, and we are still continuing to push on that frontier. When it comes to the issue of social protection, Ceravica is one of the very few countries in the developing world that have succeeded in putting about 31% of its population in social grant. And as we all know, has been documented by many studies, including those by UNDP, UNICEF, Statistics Ceravica, that social grants plays an important role in poverty reduction in the country. So these are giant strides, but in spite of so many things that have been achieved, yes, challenges abound. The higher proportion of women live below the upper poverty line, where we have about 52% of women compared to 46% of men. And when you look at the female-headed household, we have almost about 75% of them that are living below the upper poverty line, and compared to about 60% for men. Also, when it comes to the issue of higher unemployment, women are more affected by unemployment. The recent labor force survey of the Statistics Ceravica reveals that we have about 37.3% of women compared to 33% of men that are currently unemployed. Also, when it comes to the issue of unpaid employment, women are more in this particular subsector. Also, when we look at the land audit, the latest land audit for the country, you realize that only 17% of women have access to land, while compared to 46% of men. The evidence from many other studies, including Ceravica Police Service, especially the one in 2008, revealed that a woman is murdered every 3 hours in the country. And also in 2021, the Ceravica Police Service reveals that 12,702 cases of rape and sexual assaults were recorded. And if you look at the international comparison based on what World Health Organization has put, murder by intimate partners is 5 times higher in Ceravica than the global average. These are serious challenges in addition to those that have already been mentioned in the various presentations. But I just want to also underscore that at times when things like this happen, we must look at the theory of change paradigm. What is the real root cause of this issue? First, the root causes and structures that perpetuate gender inequality and marginalization can be grouped in so many categories, but I just want to underscore 2 that have been mentioned by almost all the speakers that have spoken. One is the patriarchy, where the issue of male dominance become an issue in so many areas, and also the apartheid structure is still impinging on achieving and accelerating gender equality in the country. So we need to really see how we deal with this issue, address them effectively to be able to address the key challenges that women and girls face when it comes to the issue of gender equality. Also, when we need to look at the impact of marginalization, because looking at the root causes and structures that perpetrate gender inequality is not sufficient. We need to look, because the impact of existing marginalization really have to be looked into. One, the social dimension, which could be in the area of inheritance, whether it's land or any properties. Well, there shouldn't be any kind of thing that discriminates against women and girls when it comes to the issue of inheritance, also in terms of access to health and education. So this is one thing which we need to look at. We need to undertake serious studies to look at the impact of marginalization on women and girls. Also, when it comes to the issue of economic aspects, particularly access to job opportunities. This is an important thing that will help us to really shape some of the development we are talking about. And also, the political empowerment of youth and girls is very important. Youth accounted for appreciable proportion of the electorate in South Africa. And we need to really make sure they are fully empowered, not only as an electorate, but also as leaders in society. And also, the third element of the theory of change relates to implementation of existing frameworks and mechanisms. And I think this is an important area that I consider very key because this is something that is very important. The chair of the Commission for Gender Equality has already mentioned that, but we need to really look at leveraging the strengths of the gender policy framework in the country, particularly, one, the fact that the Office of the Status of Women is located in the presidency is a very solid opportunity which many countries in Africa and outside Africa are trying to replicate. Also, the establishment of multi-sectoral national gender mechanism is another strength of the gender policy framework in South Africa, which we try as much as possible to preach to many other African, Asian, and even Latin American countries. So this is one thing we really appreciate. And also the effective deployment of gender focal persons is a necessary condition, but the sufficient thing is for us to really empower this focal person, not only in terms of having the technical skill to mainstream gender issues, but also decision power to be able to really translate some of the things into key decision actions. Well, in terms of the weaknesses, and also there's so many aspects of this that we need to really take into consideration here. The first one is lack of coherent coordination due to plethora of players. There are so many players, and which should be a strength, not a weakness. But the ability to coordinate them becomes critical in making sure this is fully achieved. So in this regard, I think that's one of the areas we think we need to look into in terms of how do we make this one work. Also, a lack of clear mechanism for resourcing and funding. Also, the Commissioner for Gender Commission mentioned that we need to really make sure we have a mechanism for resourcing not only the gender focal persons, but also the gender policy frameworks and the mechanisms we have on the ground. There is need for us to have established funding mechanism so that it's not based on ad hoc process. So that's one of the things which we consider to be very important when it comes to the issue of dealing with addressing the weaknesses. Also, limited skills, experience, and capacity of gender focal persons is something that we consider to be very, very important in moving the initiative forward. So these are things which we consider to be very important in shaping the dynamics that we are trying to put in the right perspective. And also, we need to really make sure we have very strong monitoring and evaluation system. I'm combining because currently the monitoring and evaluation framework is not strong enough for us to really be able to meet the kind of current challenges that the country is facing on this particular issue of gender policy framework. So this is something we consider very critical in this regard, and we see this as something that is very important in moving the initiative forward. Now, when it comes to the issue of best practices in ensuring that we have effective implementation of gender policy framework, and also having binding mechanism that affect almost that really is binding on the various departments and agencies of government, and if possible, even the private sector. This is something that we consider to be very important in terms of the kind of experience, the role of UNDP as the integrator of the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals across the world shows that one, we need to really invest heavily on effective coordination frameworks that will allow for more participation of the various stakeholders to be involved, that should have clear roles and responsibilities for players, and also have clear communication mechanism. The current situation where the communication mechanism is not effectively coordinated needs to be fully addressed, and clear accountability mechanism is very important. For every responsibility given to any official, there must be some element of accountability. And we thought this should constitute the element of effective coordination framework of gender policy framework or mechanism on the ground. The second best practice across many countries relates to adequate resource allocation and implementation of allocated resources. First, funding, equipment, and personnel capacity is very important. It's not just having the gender focal persons, but enhancing their capacity to be able to implement the job for which they have been appointed to do. That's one of the things which we consider to be very, very important. And Uganda has given us a very solid example where if resources are allocated to you in the previous fiscal year and you are unable to implement it to letter as planned, then it will affect your subsequent resource allocation in the parliament. So this is part of the thing. This is Uganda is one of the very solid institutions, countries that have been able to push for resource allocation and implementation of the gender mainstreaming and gender strategies at the national level. The third best practice is about transforming gender policy framework from being a generic to being a prescriptive instrument with strong accountability on departments for implementing gender strategies, action plans, and capabilities of gender focal persons. I think this is something that is very important. We need to make sure that there are some prescriptive rules and standards that needs to be followed when it comes to this issue. And this is something that has been going on in many of the Latin American countries where they ensure that gender-focused persons were given what they call the kind of capacity that is needed, and also there is clear action and penalties for those that are not meeting up to standards across ministries and departments and agencies of government. The fourth best practice, it's a situation where all departments and public institutions and public entities have obligations to implement gender-responsive planning, gender-responsive budget, and monitoring and evaluation. In Ceravica, I think DPME, Department of Women, Youth and People Living with Disability, as well as National Treasuries, have that responsibility. This needs to be cascaded to all departments and public entities to ensure that there are standards for the implementation of gender strategies in their respective organizations. And if it's not met, there should be some kind of penal system, penal and reward system that we need to put in place. I think this will help us to really accelerate the implementation. The Department of Women, Youth, and People Living with Disability need legislative authority and financial powers to coordinate, capacitate, and hold players accountable. I think this is one of the things which we consider to be very important in moving this initiative forward. And particularly, these should be supported. I mean, the needed regulatory framework for actualizing this will have to be supported by the national parliament, as well as the relevant institutions. Now, UNDP's offer in this regard, there are so many things we've been implementing, and also as the SDG integrator across the world, Sustainable Development Goals integrator across the world, UNDP works with national governments and local institutions to promote universal respect for human rights and dignity, in which every woman and girls enjoy full gender equality and all legal, social, and economic barriers to their empowerment have been removed. That's the vision of UNDP's engaging with national government as well as national institutions. And in this regard, UNDP is supporting countries in Africa, Latin America, and Asia on how to implement gender equality certification program for public institutions. It contains the ability, gender equality certification program for public institutions focuses on mainstreaming gender into programs and interventions of different institutions of government, and also add gender lens in program implementation. It also establishes standards to promote equitable work environment for men and women. It enables public institutions to track and meet gender equality goals and tackle institutional discriminations. So this is something we've been doing, and we strongly believe that public institutions meeting these standards are eligible to an award, which we have 3 categories: gold, silver, and bronze. This will be based on the level of achievements. Uganda and Rwanda are trailblazers when it comes to the implementation of gender equality seal program in Africa. The 2 of them have really gone far, and we're using this opportunity to really invite government of South Africa to join this club, where we promote gender equality standard in our government institutions in the country. And once this one is done, we are ready to start the consultation with various actors to really make sure this become a reality. And also the third thing relates to supporting countries to implement gender responsive integrated national financing framework. So this has been something we've been doing in many African countries and also Latin American countries. It helps to mainstream gender equality into financing processes. It also ensures gender checks, gender analysis, gender disaggregated data feed into financing decisions. We have Nigeria, Uganda, Gabon, and Malawi, where we are currently implementing gender responsive budgeting, and also gender-sensitive tax system in Sierra Leone. These are things which we are ready to work with various institutions of government in South Africa to really push the frontier of making sure gender-responsive budgeting is not only achieved, but also inform the financing framework in the country. Another thing which UNDP has been doing across developing countries, not only in Africa or Latin America, but also Eastern Europe and Latin America, is facilitating platforms that connect small, medium enterprises owned by women to market and finances. The Jumia platform in Uganda, the Negotia platform in Cabo Verde, the Innovation Challenge Fund in Malawi, the Youth Enterprise Action Hub in South Africa, which we are ready to work with private sector and government institutions to scale up, where we help to link women to market, link women to finances, and also enhance their capacity as entrepreneurs. The Seed Grant Award issued to women entrepreneurs affected by the July unrest in KZN and Gauteng is another initiative which we just implemented just last week, which we intend to scale up with participation of other actors. We have done a lot of things also when it comes to the issue of empowering women in farming, which we have done with Ceravica Progressive Women, and also the girls in robotics. These are things where we want to really see how girls and youth are fully involved in the management of climate change issue that we are facing across the world. So these are things which we consider to be very important. And I just want to say, the program director, it's really a pleasure for UNDP to be here. And we are ready to work with relevant institutions, both national institutions, civil society organizations, as well as the private sector, to ensure that we work with the national parliament to promote gender equality in the country. We shouldn't be deterred by the challenges we face. Our goal is for us to work with every partner to turn the challenges into opportunity for women empowerment and gender equality in South Africa. Thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you very much, Dr. Odusula. It seems as if Commissioner Peko is still not there. Let us welcome Dr. Mbawa of the Finance and Fiscal Commission and also congratulate her on her appointment as the chairperson. After this FFC have been operating with an acting chairperson for a long time. And from here on, the Deputy Speaker will take over the presiding of the program. But I just want to call Dr. Mbawa to the platform. Thank you very much, Dr. Odusula.
Thank you so much, Honorable Chairperson Lucas. It's a great pleasure for the FFC to be here. I would like to also formally greet Honorable Deputy Speaker, Honorable Sinodi as well, and also acknowledge my fellow Chapter 9 institutions, colleagues, as well as the recent speaker now, the UNDP resident representative, Dr. Adesola. I'd like to say, greet you. I also want to greet all invited guests and other speakers as well. Thank you so much for this platform, Honorable Chairperson. As the FFC, we hope that our contributions will be able to enlighten this important discussion that we have. If I may be allowed to share my presentation. Oh, okay, someone has it, okay. Okay, I see my presentation. Okay, let me just go to it. Is my presentation visible to everyone?
Yes, it is, ma'am.
Oh, thank you so much.
We'll
So
just go to presentation mode there.
okay.
Mem Tupi, Tima,
Yes.
Tima, me.
Okay.
Go ahead, me. Go ahead.
Okay.
We'll
All
sort
right.
it as we go along, I guess. Yeah.
Okay. Let me see.
Let's go back and go to slide mode. It's there. You've been skipping it.
I hope this one is the right one. Set up slideshow. Okay.
Let's go ahead.
Okay, that's fine. Thank you so much again. So my slides, our presentation this afternoon will speak largely to our brief that we were given to discuss as the FFC, the policy framing of the National Gender Policy Framework. And colleagues, my presentation will speak to firstly the role and functions of the FFC, and then I'll do a brief introduction of our thoughts regarding this matter. We'll also look at the gaps and the weaknesses on the National Gender Policy Framework, the recommendations that we want to put forward, as well as any amendments or recommendations on the current legislation. What is the FFC? The FFC is an independent constitutional body which is mandated to advise government on financial and fiscal matters, both nationally, locally, and provincially as well. The Commission must be consulted on all matters regarding financial matters. With regards to the status of women, empowerment and women's equality in the country right now, our thoughts are that South Africa's transition to democracy accelerated its re-entrance to the global environment, and the country is a signatory to various international and regional commitments to gender equality and women's empowerment. There is a plethora of legislation, and as my fellow Chapter 9 institution has stated, there is a machinery of legislation that is out there which empowers women in this country. South Africa's commitment to gender equality is established as well in the Constitution, the Bill of Rights, and the origins of this is also traced back to the Women's Charter in 1954. Various legislations and policies are in place currently that further the goals of gender equality and women's interest. Despite these commitments, legislation and policies are unacceptable in the sense that some of the inequalities do still remain in spite of the fact that we have legislation in place. For instance, in South Africa currently, 52% of females are poor, and 74.8% of female-headed households are in rural areas and are largely poor. Colleagues, COVID-19 as well has also disproportionately affected women in terms of the hours they spend in unpaid work at home. And the closure of schools, childcare facilities, and all other non-essential work have also impacted on women. And this is largely unremunerated work. So what are the gaps and weaknesses that we as the FFC have highlighted? The National Gender Policy Framework acknowledges challenges faced by the country. These are unemployment, poverty, gender inequality, and so forth, and how these challenges have been translated into national priorities and need to be addressed for the country to advance gender equality is the key goal that we want to achieve. We note that the medium-term strategic framework through the DPME is not mentioned so as to be able to monitor the priorities set and the targets that have been set to measure gender dimensions. Also, the National Gender Policy Framework does also allude to various issues, which are basically the allocation of resources by the various executive and legislative structures, coordination and capacity building, regular technical advisory that is required to ensure that this policy framework is implemented efficiently, as well as adequate staffing and institutional infrastructure, monitoring and evaluation as well, that is required for this framework to work. However, action plans and timelines are not set. So we mean that short, medium, and long-term measures on national gender machinery are not clear or coherent, and these should be prioritized as a matter of urgency. Also, there's a lack of monitoring and evaluation measures in place to assess whether these measures proposed on national gender machinery were implemented in the past or are currently being implemented. So generally, we believe that the policy framework is quite stale. It dates back to 2000 and has not been updated with recent developments in the country. Such as we know that we have the NDP as a planning document for the country, and it's quite clear and quite succinct in explaining how we can eliminate poverty and reduce inequality for inclusive growth and gender equality. Also, my fellow Chapter 9 institution has also unpacked the fact that the Commission on Gender Equality has also commissioned a study on gender analysis of the National Development Plan with the objective of assisting the state to ensure that its analysis of developmental challenges that are facing this country are adequately considered. And these do, in fact, address gender implications, gaps, and imbalances. We also have the policy on gender responsive budgeting, monitoring, evaluation, and auditing, which was passed in 2018. And this also aims to bring gender mainstreaming to public finances so as to have gender responsive budgets. We also, within that gender responsive budget monitoring and evaluation and auditing framework, we have a country gender indicator framework, which forms a key component of that. And this is drawn also from a range of existing indicator frameworks at a global, continental, regional, and national level. And we believe that this also should be measured as well in terms of ensuring gender equality. Also, there is a report on the 25-year review of women empowerment and gender equality in South Africa from social transformation and social justice. And we believe that this also should be incorporated into the framework. And we also believe that there is limited and lack of mention of key role players, such as the DPME, the Department of Women, Youth, and People with Disabilities, National Treasury, and Statistics in the current framework. And here we note that the National Gender Policy Framework has key activities and outputs from applications of project lifecycle to gender mainstreaming, but no timeframes and implementation thereof are set, which we think is also a limitation. The recommendations that we want to put forward as well on the National Gender framework is that action plans and timelines need to be set. These can be either short, medium, or long term in terms of when these measures or national gender machinery should be accomplished. We also believe that monitoring and evaluation measures should be in place to assess whether these measures that are being proposed on the national gender machinery were met and what interventions should be in place. We also believe that the NDP should also be considered as a key planning document which will inform
Dr. Bava? Yeah, you are muted. Mute and unmute, please, so that we can hear you.
Good morning, honorable members. I'm not sure whether I can continue. Nomonde Matubula from the Financial and Fiscal Commission if Dr. Mbava.
Yes, please
Not
go
come
ahead
through.
so that when the chair comes back, she can reconnect. Go ahead, Nomonde.
Okay, I'm trying to put on. Thank you, honorable member. I'll just continue to where she left off, where she was talking about the recommendations that needs to be in place. We are of the view that the 2020 NDP review progress made on targets set by the country since the adoption of the NDP, it has recommendations and gaps in it. So it should be also be part of this NGPF so that we know where is the base. Also, we talked about earlier the gaps on the GRPB MA, which aims to bring gender mainstreaming to public finances so as to have gender responsive budget. We are of the view that already this framework, it has timelines and implementation strategy in place, which are categorized in the short, medium, and long term. So we are of the view that the NGPF needs to be in touch with this. Also in the gender responsive planning, budgeting, monitoring, and evaluation, there are country gender indicator framework mentioned there, which are also mentioned in the 25-year review of women empowerment and gender equality. So we are of the view all these important measurements or steps that have been taken in government should also be looked at in the NGMPF and be updated, including the important key role players such as the DPME, the Department of Women, National Treasury, and Statistics SA on issues of gender mainstreaming. It should be updated in this NGPF. Next slide, please. Here also we looked at the amendments or recommendations that the FFC is of the view that they should also be looked at. We know currently we have legislation such as the Municipal Fiscal Powers and Functions, the Municipal Finance Management Act, the Appropriation Act, and the Division of Revenue Act, and the Public Finance Management Act. We are of the view that reforms in these acts, they should be considered so that laws are not gender neutral. For example, in terms of this legislation that I've mentioned, I will just read that the MFPS and the MFA, they mention in the act. The Act regulates the powers of municipalities to impose surcharges on fees. Example, Part 5 of Section 5 of the Act can be gender mainstream so that we assess the impact of the legislation on men, women, and people with disabilities. Currently, the Act, it said a municipality, group of municipality or organized local government must submit an application to the minister which application must specify the compliance burden of the taxpayers. We are of the view that as FFC, this clause can be extended to specify compliance burden on taxpayers by gender and disability. Also, this act, it also mentioned that a municipality, group of municipality or organized local must submit an application to the minister with application which describe the estimation method and assumption to determine the economic impact on individual and business. We are of the view that this clause can be changed to read the economic impact on individuals by gender and business. Next slide, please. Here on the public finance management, the public finance management, we know that it regulates financial management in the national government and provincial government and management thereof. The Public Finance Management Act 27, Section 4 states that when the annual budget is introduced in the National Assembly or the provincial legislature, the accounting officer for each department must submit to Parliament or the provincial legislature as may be appropriate measurable objectives for each main division within the department vote. We are of the view that this section can be extended to say a mandatory gender equality certificate for the annual budgets, which integrate gender equality by departments. In Uganda, this has been done. The Public Finance Management Act has a mandatory gender and equity certificate, which national and district level must obtain for their annual budget. This certificate, it assesses whether budgets have integrated gender equality by departments at national and district levels. Where budget falls short of the integration, they are revised so that they are able to obtain the certificate and be approved. The benefit of the certificate also allows legislatures to systematically hold government agencies accountable for their record support for gender equality and women's empowerment. Also, FFC, we are also of the view that in 2013, the Parliament introduced the Women Empowerment Gender Bill. We are also of the view that this process should be finalized, as it will give impetus to the current activities happening in the sector. Also, in 2022, annual submission research that FFC does, the FFC in 2022, it also conducted a study which address gender inequality through gender budgeting in the public sector. This study assessed the effectiveness of key departmental budgets in addressing gender equality commitments, as well as adequacy of their legislative policy and institutional frameworks in promoting gender responsive budgeting in government. The findings of the study was that there is limited mainstreaming of gender issues in departmental budget process. The main reason for that is that the departments, they generally lack gender disaggregated data and information to enable the implementation to happen. The lack of gender disaggregated data, it hinders the effective translation of gender commitments into budgetary allocation. We are of the view that GRB is difficult, if not impossible to undertake without an institutional plan to effect it. Also, the FFC, the study also find that there is limited gender disaggregated data. The analysis indicated that gender disaggregated information could be found in other domains or within the working knowledge of department, but such information is not integrated into strategic departments as well as annual performance plans of the department. Also, we are of the view that, for instance, Stats SA and CGE have generated gender reports with gender disaggregated data, which could be helpful for various departments, but departmental systems are not sufficiently mature to integrate such data. Next slide, please. Also, what we found also in the study was lack of detailed departmental gender-specific performance indicators. Departmental performance indicators are not sufficiently detailed in providing data on the number of women and girls who benefit from their programs. For example, the Department of Health will have various indicators to monitor the progress of its programs. However, these indicators, except for program S, explicitly focused on women cannot be utilized to determine who benefits from the budget in terms of women and when. Similarly, in the Department of Education annual reports and annual performance plans, they do or have defined indicators with set targets, but such indicators are not disaggregated to enable a determination of beneficiaries of these services and facilities in terms of gender. They will just say that a number of learners have got this, but they are not disaggregated. The Department of Women, Youth, Persons with Disability is at the heart of coordinating gender equality efforts in the country, and it has various indicators related to each program and target set, and the number of reports and intervention that should be in place. The department is expected to take a lead in coordinating these gender responsive measures. Also, in terms of legislation, policy, and institutional framework, gender equality and women's empowerment are often an afterthought or relegated to a sector or specific outcome rather than an integral component across all government sectors. Oversight on gender equality and women empowerment also tends to be limited to Portfolio Committee on Women, Youth, and Persons with Disability, yet it should be cutting across committees of the Parliament of the Republic. The CGE, which is also mandated to promote gender equality and advance the protection, development, and attainment of gender equality in South Africa. However, we found that the CGE budget is mainly consumed by the compensation of employees, and that also can pose a high risk in terms of it being able to carry out some of the priorities and mandates that it needs to fulfill. The next slide. In terms of the recommendation, the FFC recommend that the Department of Women, Youth, Persons with Disability and DPME should finalize the institutionalization of gender responsive planning through the national and provincial government, as it has been stated in the framework. National Treasury, together with the Department of Youth, Persons with Disability and DPME, should spearhead the implementation of gender responsive budget and mainstreaming gender responsive budget through the entire scope of budget process as it applies to the national and provincial government. Also in collaboration with COGTA in terms of mainstreaming the gender responsive budget at the local government. The National Treasury and the Department of Women, Youth, Persons with Disability should consider the introduction of a formal gender auditing process to be conducted by a relevant independent institution in respect of non-financial performance information of departments, entities, and municipalities. Next slide. The Department of Women should coordinate and spearhead initiatives focused on capacity building of political and administrative leadership on gender responsive planning, budgeting, monitoring, and valuation, as well as auditing at all levels of government. Such initiatives are to include the training of budget officers on gender responsive budget and the use of gender disaggregated data in the budget process. Also, the Department of Women, Youth, and Persons with Disabilities should, on an annual basis, prepare a comprehensive report on how the Division of Revenue Bill responds to gender inequality and how fiscal policy translate the government's gender equality commitments. The report should be tabled for consideration by the relevant committees to Parliament. Lastly, we are of the view that the Department of Women, Youth, Persons with Disability, together with Stats SA, should provide explicit guidelines for collecting and integrating gender disaggregated data to ensure the visibility of girls and women in government programs in the budgeting process within government. The department also should invest in statistical capacity building in government to improve the measurement of gender equality indicators and the collection of gender disaggregated data. Thank you, Chair. That was my last slide. I'm not sure whether Dr. Mbava is back now. Thank you.
This is what we call combat readiness. The chair trouble emerging. Hope that she was able to reconnect so that she stays with us. She's going to have to answer all the difficult questions. when they do arise. I am advised that Mepeku is on the platform, and that we may have some point where we are going to discuss this has been a presentation heavy session so far. This is me reacting to it. And the order of let's get to the next presentation so that we will give Madam Peku an opportunity soon. Let's give to the head of the Parliamentary Budget Office to speak, and then we will work through how we factor in some brief 5-minute comfort break and indicate anything else following that. Let's go ahead. Dr. Janchis, are you here? Linking. He seems to be flying in and out. I've been
Deputy
noticing
Speaker,
that. Yes.
I may, through you. Commissioner Peku is actually between two meetings. I would like to humbly request that she does her presentation. Dr. Jantjies is still preparing. He just needs about 10-15 minutes. So may I humbly propose that, Commissioner?
Okay. He's already here, but that's fine. Commissioner Peku, okay. You see, this is what technology does, allows people to gravitate between 3 meetings in a session. Okay, let's hear you, Mayor. Janchis, please give us space briefly. You'll follow through as soon as you finish. Go ahead, Mayor. Thank you.
Thank you, Ndate Chair, Mudula Stulo, and thank you to all the honorable members and representatives of various institutions. All protocols are humbly observed. I'm going to take us through a very brief assessment of just a few thoughts. I haven't prepared a PowerPoint, if I may. It's just going to be some notes. The first speak that I'd like to talk to is a very broad understanding or a very broad analysis of where we are as women globally and locally in relation to the economics of COVID. Secondly, to then think through perhaps some of the more the macroeconomics of what it means to build back better or to build forward radically differently. And lastly, to provide a few provocations on some of the components of a potential economic recovery, especially those which center women's economic agency and women's economic sovereignty, so to say. So without much of an ado, firstly, I guess, in partial response to the stimulus package, we're aware that there are various phases that were put into place through the National Treasury and also through the South African Reserve Bank, who announced a number of fiscal and monetary and various interventions to bolster the economy, to provide much needed safety nets for the most economically vulnerable and the most economically fragile and dispossessed. And many of these, of course, will be the people who, the pandemic has done is to accentuate the many existing pandemics, including of unemployment, including of limited or weak service delivery, including of limited access to opportunity, including, of course, of inequality. So the existing pandemics in our society, which all link to a very fragmented economic milieu. So the first phase was to mitigate effects of COVID-19 on businesses, on various communities, and on individual. I don't have the gender desegregated data here with me, but having done some research, especially through the South African Women in Dialogue, one can report that the percentages of women who were able to access a lot of the relief for business incubation and business funding is very limited. So I did a random survey of about 30 businesses in my own sphere of influence and in my own immediate parameter. And out of those, only 2 had received any form of funding, had been able to access. And these, of course, will all be people who have some level of business literacy and some wherewithal around the kind of milieu of getting through bureaucracy. But the paperwork was daunting. The support systems for navigating that were very daunting. And amongst those, not a single woman has received any of that. So in terms of an anecdotal report, that is basically what it's looking like. The second phase was, of course, to stabilize the economy by addressing the decline in supply and demand, and by trying to protect jobs. In fact, we have lost 2 million jobs. And one of the things that we didn't do was to perhaps target particular interventions to the jobs, to the sectors which are able to retain the most amount of people. Was a couple of things. One was to target I was just looking, my internet seemed to be freezing. One was to target the sectors in which, by for example, quantitative easing, which is then providing money into those sectors. And I'm not a fan of printing money, please hear me well, but as a temporary short-term measure to stimulate production, to stimulate consumption, and to stimulate the circulation of movement in those key sectors. The other thing that some of them did was to ensure that there was desegregated protection of jobs. So what unfortunately often happens is that in these situations, some gendered and quite, anti-feminist impulses come into play. The one being that where the choices have to be made about who's going to lose a job. Typically, unfortunately, women especially including in COVID, have been the one. So what many sectors and countries did in those sectors was to ensure that if the tough choices had to be made about whose job to protect, they would rather protect women's jobs, not only as a social imperative, but also understanding that the work that women do both in the marketplace and in the realms of social reproduction, that I'll speak more to slightly further on, are quite indispensable, and that somehow women seem to be slightly more reliable curators of work, of income, and of employment opportunities. The other piece of this is then that the third phase was to put in place measures for the recovery of the economy as it tried to emerge from COVID-19. These are well documented, including the 500 billion social and economic stimulus package and so forth. I won't go into the broad details of that, but broadly speaking, this included social grants, enabling municipalities to provide emergency water supplies, increased disinfection of public transport and facilities, and providing food and shelter to the homeless. Again, as a gender disaggregated matter, this has not been adequately addressed. The other piece of this was then job creation and protection to the tune of about 100 billion. And I won't go into the nitty gritty of that, but 47.6% of employees in the micro sector are women compared to 30% of men. And on any given day, I have often thought that certainly we need to protect small to medium businesses because they account for 65 to 70% of employment, and they also account for almost a third of GDP contribution in this country. The other was also a bank guarantee fund, which was to enable banks to extend credit facilities to distressed businesses. And I've already mentioned that those businesses did not per se, those funds did not per se reach women entrepreneurs, women in business, and women who hire other women and hire other people to very adequately. And lastly were, of course, the array of tax relief measures which were put in place, some of which have been overtaken by the latest budget, in fact. But be that as it may. One of the things that happens, of course, during economic crisis is that the indigent, including women, are often seen as targets for social assistance and social safety nets. What often happens is that the working poor, and by this I mean the people who are working very hard and yet are unable to meet their day-to-day needs efficiently, especially those who are engaged in what is sometimes called the informal economy, or some would prefer to say the gray economy, the parallel economy. Others would even say it is the real economy, are not recognized as legitimate targets for economic rescue, because those recovery efforts are believed to be really targeted at people who can tangibly be seen to be either business owners, entrepreneurs, or have a 9-to-5 job. However, again, at least 70% of people who are not employed, but who are who have sources of income, source their livelihoods from this parallel economy. And again, it has to be said that the majority of those are women in the employment sector. So the people who we see not only as street vendors, people who are selling fat cooks, but also people who are entrepreneurs across the sector, whether it's in clothing, whether it's in selling IT, computer parts, and also the traveling that takes place, people who travel as far as Korea, as Thailand, and so forth, collecting computer components, collecting perfumes, collecting books, collecting other forms of IT and technology, electronics. It's a wide spectrum of activity, of skills, and of products which are now available in the parallel market. And I think that what has not really happened efficiently is for our policy making to catch up with the reality of that. At some stage earlier on during the COVID crisis, the pandemic, which is now, I suppose, endemic, since we are now living with COVID as almost a permanent feature of our lives for the foreseeable future, there was a drive for informal workers, so-called informal workers, but a drive for women women who are in the parallel economy included, to then seek recognition of their work from the state so that they could also be part of this supplementary budget which was tabled, that they could also be part of the allocations in this regard, and be part of this social safety net that would also then give some loan guarantees for their businesses, enable them to continue to sustain themselves, and enable them to continue to participate and to contribute to the economy and also to social reproduction. I think that the other thing that I'd like to briefly touch on is that while the lockdown initially slowed down the rate of COVID-19 infection, and despite some of the unfortunate press that South Africa has received internationally, we've been almost exemplary in some of our detection and so forth, it did provide the space for us to prepare for the rising number of cases of families, workers, businesses, and communities. And what this also did was it highlighted the lack of healthcare as a part of social and economic infrastructure. What happens is in this regard is that, of course, again, where the health system is fragile, or overutilized, overstrained. Very typically, again, it is women who are forced to then take up the gap where the state is not able or not willing to meet that obligation. And even so, what this does, it has increased in fragility, but it has also splintered the very limited time that women do to pursue economic activities and other social and leisure activities, which would lead me to the argument that I think that I'd like to propose, that healthcare as part of the economic buttress of our country must be considered as absolutely central. If nothing else, COVID-19 has illustrated those fragilities and how essential it is that healthcare is regarded as an essential part of the economic lifeblood of our country. If I can skip then to the macroeconomics of all of this. So as I mentioned earlier, are we building back better, or are we building forward differently and more radically? So I think the notion that we can talk about business as usual in such unusual times and in such perverse times, that it seems to be a bit of an oxymoron. Now, given the available funding that COVID-19 relief has offered in South Africa, there is still an opportunity to examine existing macroeconomic modeling. And there's also the opportunity to consider whether macroeconomic policies are mistakenly viewed as gender neutral, when in fact the choices that are made, the policy choices, the political choices that are made around macroeconomic policy are highly gendered. And of course, these reflect existing structural, societal, and attitudinal biases. So whilst many developing countries have developed the capacity to respond to the pandemic, others have been severely destabilized by the systematic dismantling of the state through different versions of structural adjustment or new adjustment programs or PRSPs. Now, the privatization and the delineation of essential services like healthcare and different social protection, water and sanitation services is extremely problematic. And I'd like to suggest again here that this is again an important moment to decide, and I think even the national health, the debates around the national health bill come into play here, and I'm not going to go into those because they're not the ambit of this particular presentation, but I'd like to suggest that again, this is a really important moment to decide what kind of a society that we're going to build forward, and what is the kind of economic, socioeconomic infrastructure that is necessary to build it forward. Is it those who have medical aid, or is it those who are left to the vagaries of very overcrowded, overburdened, and under-resourced public health systems? And understanding that, again, when the public healthcare systems fail, and and of course limited access that most people have to medical aid, it then falls upon the social reproductive work, which is often unpaid, of women to then go into play. And this is where I'd like to go next, is whether or not we are ready to recognize and appreciate what, again, we have called, I think euphemistically, the care economy, and understanding that for people who have very small bunsis who were at school around the kitchen table, especially during the first year of COVID-19 and of the lockdown, it was very, very difficult to manage and to mediate and to differentiate between the public and the private space, between work as a place, home as a place of work, and the external work that you actually do, and the office as a place of work, and that these binaries have not been adequately addressed. The cost of this as well has not been adequately addressed. So what would it cost if states were then to put in place, our state were then to put in place subsidized healthcare, subsidized childcare in every community, understanding that, again, the luxury of sending our little angels to Montessori and private creches for 1,500 rands a month, where they get snacks from Woolworths, is a luxury that maybe most of us on this call can afford, but the vast majority of people in this country cannot afford. So if we are then understanding that the economy is not just about the stuff that happens in markets, but it is also about the social reproduction, the social infrastructure that is needed to contribute to that economy, we can then perhaps think around a policy-making framework that is more inclusive and much more panoramic in output. A piece of that, again, is then linked to this whole closure of the system and whole closure of our economy as we understood it, particularly during the earlier days of the pandemic, and even now off and on, where in waves schools are forced to close down, is then the impact of education, which then has meant that, again, we have to look at what does education mean, and the education infrastructure for schools which don't have things like aftercare that are available or that are built in, or that perhaps are safe environments, that are even safe spaces. And again, even though we seem to think that we can delineate the idea of safe education and effective education and safe spaces from the economy, I don't believe that we can. Because again, this all links into the social reproductive work that women are forced to do, are forced into by societal norms and attitudes, by patriarchy, by chauvinism, and so forth. And then I think here I'd like to then go into a piece around what it would look like then for the sort of social reproduction to social reproductive functions to be accounted for in our state budget and in our economic reading. So the one is that, of course, that there are a series of issues with GDP and what it measures and doesn't measure. So it doesn't measure voluntary work. It does not measure unpaid domestic work. It barely measures social reproduction. It doesn't measure the time spent for commuting even to and from work. It doesn't measure the things in between. And so I'd like to really rethink whether or not we can think about a gender responsive and human dignified integration of economic and social plans that would apply lessons that have been learned from previous pandemics, previous outbreaks, and previous economic crises, where frankly gender recovery plans and analysis were quite absent. We should have learned from HIV/AIDS. We should have learned from the Ebola pandemic, Ebola epidemics in different parts of this continent, and so forth. There's one seminal World Bank report, for example, on the impact then, this is looking retrospectively, on Ebola economic impacts, which somehow failed to discuss how acute the gendered economic impacts were of that particular pandemic. And as a result, what happened was that the impact of when people returned to work after that, nobody seemed to look, not enough people looked carefully at where women were returning to in the economic milieu. Many of them were returning to jobs that were less paid, less status, or more precarious than even that which was there before. And I think that's a mistake that in the South African context, we would like to learn from and learn very quickly from. There are also other indicators that use the language of reducing the resilience of women to shocks. And I think that using languaging like resilience has its own problematics, because it then assumes that we must absorb and subsidize where perhaps the other subsidies, financial subsidies, social subsidies, and social infrastructural subsidies are not in place, which I think that is fairly problematic. So what has happened, particularly over the last, drawing from this, the research that I was part of with the South African Women in Dialogue, 86% of women compared to 73% of men reported that they would not be able to raise emergency funds within 7 days during any crisis, and if any other pandemic or emergency situation were to take place where they lost their job quickly. The statistics have told us time after time that most of us are 1 or 2 paychecks away from absolute destitution. Scary, but that's true, including the middle classes. And this is not different for people who are either the working poor or unwaged workers, so to speak, who are even in more precarious situations. And bearing in mind that the unwaged, amongst the working poor and the unwaged workers, again, there's a gendered majority who occupy that space. So women have a greater dependency on gifts and loans from family and friends, savings groups, employers, money lenders, mashonisa, which makes us far more financially vulnerable, since families and friends are also likely to be equally affected by the pandemic. So what about the economic recovery? How can we get out of this quagmire? I don't have answers for now, but I do have a few suggestions. The one is really to rethink the idea of what a worker is and what work is, to really rethink our definitions and this delineation between the formal and the informal, or what I prefer to call the parallel gray economy and the mainstream economy or the market economy. The second is that I also like to suggest that when we're thinking around social care, social infrastructure, social grants, that it's probably a good moment for us to reorientate away from the idea that these are somehow favors that are being done at state largesse. So I mean, while COVID-19 has slowed down or even stopped production, the impact on supply chains, on labor demand, on employment could actually result in protracted intervals of retrenchment and escalating unemployment. And what some scholars have said, that the wait and see approach that has been adopted by a lot of economic agents could potentially be a pandemic of its own making if this continues. So nevertheless, what one can think think about is that indeed, whilst women have had less capacity to withstand the pandemic's consequences due to low access to savings and loans, and also that there's been an impact on the loss on food security and food sovereignty, much greater economic loss, and also that job losses weigh much more greatly on women than on men. And of course, because of this kind of biases that I mentioned, that in a situation where jobs have to be lost, often women are the ones who are let go first, even though they may be more skilled and may even have been there longer. It does all come back to the notion of what social protection and social infrastructure is available. So the rise of cash transfers, ironically, the pandemic may have presented us with the opportunity to enact mechanisms to provide an economically secure future for the broader population. We have responded in different ways, and I've already highlighted some of South Africa's responses already. But in terms of a few considerations, I won't call them recommendations, but in terms of a few considerations to offer to the House, the one would be adapting existing schemes and selecting different types of social protection. For example, easing on existing conditions, linking these to schooling, to health requirements could potentially diminish the viral spread and also benefit women who are almost entirely fulfilling social reproductive funding. So medical subsidies, educational subsidies, and a combination of this and cash grants as well. The other pieces of this is that the logistics of safely administering in-kind transfers, such as toiletries, such as sanitary towels and food, are extremely important because, unfortunately, again, it is women who are usually the first to reduce their food intake as a response to food insecurity. Since this pandemic began, which is now endemic, the food security has increased, food insecurity and lack of food sovereignty, particularly in African households, has increased by 11%, which is a huge number. So that could be another opportunity. The other could potentially be targeting disbursements. So mechanisms can be can be used or developed to identify households and individuals for assistance. But a lot of this is also linked to the notion of moving away from from poverty shaming, which seems to be a feature of some of the policy making across the world, and South Africa, unfortunately, being no exception. So this idea that little girls are chasing after blessers and little girls are making babies so that they can get grants, so that they can do their hair. I'd like to say respectfully to the House that there is absolutely no evidence. People like the HSRC, the Medical Research Council, and others have done extensive research that in no way corroborates some of these social myths and mores, which then unfortunately become popularized in popular discourses and in public domain, and maybe perhaps influence on policy making. As a result of this, I think I think this is an important moment to go back to the idea of social grants and social benefit transfer as a restoration of the social compact between the states and its most economically dispossessed citizens. I think I'll leave it right there in the interest of time, and hopefully we can take up this discussion at another time. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner. Really appreciate your comprehensive view of the issues that really matter in the subject we are discussing. I'm going to suggest, Chairperson, that we take a 5-minute comfort break. And then when we come back, we'll say more about what needs to happen. Yes, let's give you 5 minutes as a comfort break, and stay on, don't delink, stay on. And yeah, okay.
Recording stopped.
Thank you very much. We now invite Dr. Jantjies, the Director for the Parliamentary Budget Office, to speak to us. Thank you very much, Mayor Peku, Commissioner Peku. You and the UNDP representative have cut out very interesting, useful things so that we lay the foundation for ongoing presentations. Thank you very much. Let's hear Dr. Jantjies. And please, for all of us, we've not been tough with timekeeping. You know, that's my job description in Parliament. I'm a timekeeper. You know that I'm a timekeeper. So I request that all of us keep to time so that we increase the amount of time we have for interaction and discussion by as many people as possible, because there are sittings beginning at 2 o'clock. So we really request that if you can contribute a minute or two to that discussion, we will appreciate it. Thank you very much. Please go ahead.
Good afternoon, Deputy Speaker. Good afternoon, honor members. Good afternoon, colleagues. Thank you so much for the opportunity. I will try to reduce time, Deputy Speaker. Thank you so much for that alert. I think a lot has been covered by, as the Deputy Speaker was saying, by the other speakers came before. I'll try to really cut out some of the areas that could be more value added in discussions. And I really think the opportunity to contribute to this in this program today. I think, in given context, really, it's really starting from the questions that we ought to ask ourselves, society, in terms of how, as a country, much progress has been made in the last couple of decades in terms of realizing our gender equity aspirations, particularly in society, and really start to ask the question of how has some of how has been some of the impact of the policies set out the government in addressing gender equality matters, and also decomposing these conversations, because most of the time, as colleagues have noted, that we tend to lump up everything together, and it doesn't help us a lot in trying to realize or actually see where the challenges are and what works and what doesn't work. In particular, look at public sector, what works, look at government in particular, what works in contributing to realizing these aspirations for ourselves. Many governments certainly and institutions have noted that the COVID-19 pandemic threatens to reverse the hard-won gains over the years, particularly where we've been between the 2020 to the COVID-19, in particular looking at various sectors of society have been differently affected by the COVID-19, and globally women and girls have been impacted more than other sectors of society, and particularly, which rings a bell in terms of how our certain the way we think about the economy, think about society, think about households, and its role in providing stability, even towards economic stability that we so much looking for, and how really structured and how does it impact society. So certainly raise the questions in terms of again understand the economy, society, and how this understanding perpetuates the exclusion of women in participation in the economy, but also the activities that are often not regarded as value add, which are in a way because provide support in household, provide broadly economic activities society are not accounted for in our understanding of the economy and society. Thinking around gender responsive budgeting is not really new concept, Deputy Speaker and all members. Think about the 80s feminist economists that have argued a lot for the need for the gender responsive budgeting in literature. And another example also in the recent time, we've seen a policy by an African government, Rwanda, which has found that actually investment, for example, in clean water or running tap water has not only kept diseases, but also freed girls to be able to go back to school, because before they were, required to go fetch water, and which really took some more time away from what we've been way of enhancing in developing in that regard. The South African first, in South Africa as well, we've considered the discussion around gender responsive budgeting earlier in the 90s, 1995, and the 800 democratic dispensation. And clearly, the issue of leadership in the area, but also having so many competing interests, led to the conversation being parked on the side and led to some of these inequality perpetuating over time. And it's very important, it's great that the conversation, the art, we came back quite a lot, and really try to put it in the mainstream conversation around the standing of economic society and how policies are to inform to impact, or how they like to impact on our aspirations in this regard of society. So basically, the gender responsibility, the planning, implementation, monitoring, and oversight is critical to these conversations. That we have very clear mechanisms around standing that, but also the thinking about the planning. I mean, I'm speaking from the legislative point of view, from the oversight point of view. So it's very critical as a really trying to understand our conversation for today. I mean, what we've seen, on what we're trying to emphasize here as well, is really understanding that gender responsive budgeting brings women's issues at the heart of governance planning, which is the Minister of Finance. And it's very important to really somebody's okay, somebody speaking. All right, thanks. Basically, if judgments about what makes sense for women and the general good are being formed within the finance ministry in itself, really there's a lot of progress that we make from what we see. My inputs, Deputy Speaker, just have four main themes here, which is really looking at tools for gender responsive budgeting. Secondly, look at some of the key issues of oversight requirements and consideration. Thirdly, look at broader socio-economic consideration for oversight, and zoom in quite specifically on one particular item on the money bills and related aspect, and what are some of the key considerations to take into account in going forward. Quickly starting with the first one, the tools for gender responsive budgeting. Different tools are needed really at different stages of formulation, implementations, and oversight for gender responsive budgeting. In particular, some of the issues we've looked at in our thinking start with the gender impact assessment, analysis on the gender impact of existing or even new budget. It's very important to have that on a very continuous space. At the time, we also in the PBO, we are also thinking in terms of how our role, what we do, and we do provide budget analysis, how we process this understanding in the process, and also try to reflect some of these issues. I remember in one of the discussions we had around the text specifications for gender, and we always raise that as an issue to understand in that regard. And indeed, we have attempted to bring these analysis to form part of the mainstream analysis that we have for our budget analysis. The second tool really talks about the gender dimensions in performance setting. That's really about identifying gender equality indicators and objectives as a part of the performance budgeting framework. This could also be considered in various government functions of sphere, ensuring that we have this clear setting, indicators that determines whether we're realizing the aspirations we set out in the women charter set out already. The third indicator, the third tool is around the gender budget statements, summary of how budget measures are intended to support gender equity priorities. This must be accompanied by budget allocations over the MTF period. This is critical for when oversight bodies consider plans relative to the outcomes in that regard, to say, how do we make sure that this thinking is infused within the whole oversight process in different functions of government, and not as opposed to letting this thinking be isolated without being present in the whole. Sorry. All right. The next tool is around gender budget tagging, which really is about tracking how our programs and activities support gender equality objectives, helping to quantify financial flows, real-time budget audits, which we've seen during the pandemic by the HGSA, has demonstrated and the possibility during the COVID-19 of having real-time audits or real-time analysis of how would impact on the budget taking in that regard. The fifth component really tool is around the gender perspective evaluation and performance audit, which really is going to be about identify whether gender goals relating to different policies and programs were achieved on a regular basis, e.g. through the in-year monitoring process. This tool is critical in measuring that there is a follow-through, in measuring that there is a need for follow-through in terms of oversight mechanisms, or as also emphasized within the money bills in particular. When you look at the budget review recommendation reports, which are used by committees, but there has to be a need for follow-through on issues related to gender parity, gender equity in this regard. Maybe this is one of the areas that requires further attention, in particular to improve parliamentary oversight model over the years in realizing some of realizing that the outcomes set out for gender budgeting are actually realized. In our recent budget analysis, particularly we did it earlier this morning in relation to DORA, in fact, there is an indication that indigent policy that inform budget allocation for local government spheres requires, there's a clear requirement that certain households needs to be supported in this regard, but only fewer households are actually supported than what has been allocated. And that really means that most of the time in these strategies, women are mainly impacted, or households led by women are mainly impacted in that regard, because they have to do some of the more care work, which often are left to them. And the question here is that what happens to the different households which are not been allocated, or care or service budget has not been allocated for basic services. The last tool talks to the gender perspective and spending review. This is really to ensure that spending prioritization has a positive impact on gender equality goals. There is a need for a clear defined gender goals used in informing spending patterns in particular functions of government. There has to be a tool that is inserted there that ensures that we look at that in that regard. The second theme is really around some of the key issues, requirements, and consideration that should be taken into account. Frequent and predetermined reviews for progress over certain intervals are required in terms of models which are set up in relation to gender responsive budgeting in this regard. There is a consensus, though, Deputy Speaker, and members that phrase at the time in relation to the quantity data set for these reviews to take place. In our recent analysis, we have raised concerns over the suspension of the much useful, general household survey, published. And our concerns here is to say, if we are going to do analysis and review, ensuring the budget is informed by understanding of our households, having such information is very critical in informing whether these gender budgeting, gender responsive budgeting is very in line with what really is happening in the site. For example, StatSA has only conducted 2 time surveys since the democratic dispensation. I think it's in 2000 and 2010. And the survey really provides information on the way in which South African women and men spend the time. Such information contributes to a great understanding of policymakers of the economic and social well-being of different societal groups. In particular, the study provides new information on the division of both paid and paid labor between women and men, and greater insight into less well understood productive activities such as subsistence work, casual work, and work in informal sectors gets indicated there. Now, if you don't have that information readily available or updated information, really that raises the question in terms of how far we are able to realize some of these changes that we do with regards to women charters identified there. The first survey was meant to happen in 2016, and I think the point here is that there's a need for really reliable source of data sets, information, credible sources that enables the policy in real life policy planning, budget planning in particular, that it's informed by such information. Our concern is that that information is being hampered in real life. In our thinking, support for Parliament oversight, we aim to develop some of these thinking around these gender-sensitive analysis that can really assist focus and strengthen the Parliament oversight scrutiny more generally. We are aware that it's up to the members of Parliament to exercise oversight, over these mechanisms, but I think we will aim to provide that information as required. The third theme for the last one talks about some of the broad socio-economic consideration for oversight itself, and really the context here, the context of fiscal policy stances taken by government over the years is very important to understand, or just have an understanding that particularly the fiscal consideration stance must have taken serious, must really be taken serious. The understanding of that and the oversight questions that needs to be asked is whether the adequate resources have been or will be allocated for a meaningful response to gender needs of the population once baseline studies has been conducted. Context of occupational segregation also becomes important. I know some colleagues raised this as well. Women typically are overrepresented in certain feminine occupations, and that are lower, which are lower paid and also often involve care, professional participation, and so on, service and sale, clinical, and so on. And really, literature does know that how occupations that involves working with people in the production of services tend to be undervalued relative to occupations that involves working with machines and tools in production and goods services. This undervaluation reflects the undervaluation of the care work that women do in households, in their homes. This requires that the mindset has to somehow be changed, a shifting in mindset in trying to understand the importance of some of this household, this care work. Third point, is there a need to ask questions as to whether South African Employment Equity Act to eliminate gender and race wage disparities have not been adequately implemented? So there has to be a question there. On an average, women earn 30% less than their male counterparts, with Black women earning lesser in that regard. This inequality is high amongst the skilled workers. Capacity needs to be built on implementing some of this gender policy. The care home, the care economy, as Commissioner Pecos noted, is there need for a mindset change? We are speaking there. Is there a need for mindset change? And this shifted. Is there a need for mindset shift? Research by the International Trade Union Confederations does show that on South African that the multipliers are high in care economy. And really we need to, example was given there that the 2% of GDP were invested in, if 2% of GDP was invested in health and care sectors, it would generate increases in overall employment close to more than 400,000. And great investment into care can create jobs and should be seen as economic activities. At the same time, also we see other countries, particularly developed countries, care is a very important player in the economy, but also understanding that
Dr. Janji,
it ensures, sir.
My apology, man. Please, man, sum up. We are in trouble with time. I'm going to have to announce a cut-off time for other speakers. Otherwise, we are going to be in trouble. Yeah, we regret having to do that. Yeah, there are about 4 speakers left, and we don't want any one of them to not speak. So please.
Thanks so much for speaking. It's the last few points that I mentioned is really around I really skipped some of the sections I wanted to talk to, but I think narrowing down to the Money Bills Act, one of the reasons of the Money Bills Act was amended in 2018 was the fact that the oversight model itself required a very inclusionary mechanisms on public participation, take center stage in the budget process, and therefore the amended Money Bills Act would have to help Parliament in really addressing some of the questions like how can we get more civil society to engage in the parliamentary budget and oversight process, in particular address some of the key issues that are raised related to within the Women Charter, and how do we actively ensure that transparency, access to data and information to those are outside government, to enable them to engage with budget and issues that directly impact them in this regard. And clearly the importance here is how do we make sure that the Women Charter outcomes that are set out are infused within this process set out in the Manifest Act. Deputy Speaker, thanks so much. I left some other part, but I'll share the notes with the colleagues. Thanks so much for that.
No, thank you very much. Yes, your presentation will be shared. Thank you very much. We appreciate that. Let's go to the next speaker. And this is Menkomo, from development economist at Development Economics, Oxfam, South Africa board chairperson. Please talk to us, ma'am.
Thank you so much, Chair.
And please, as I said to Dr. Janki, I request that you try and sum up, give us the highlights of your presentation. We will definitely share it, and we will create an opportunity later for broader discussion. We will invite you back. Pardon us for that.
All right.
Okay.
Excellent.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Chair. I'm really going to try and summarize because I think both Commissioner Peko and Dr. Gay have really covered some of the points, but I would still want to send a clear message in relation to the ambit of our conversation today. So we're making actually, having this conversation today right on the back of CSW meeting, which is the status on gender, on women's status in the world, which really looks at advancing gender equality, climate change, and disaster risk policy. And I think what is coming out of that conversation already, even though it's earlier days, today is a third day, and the message that the General Secretary put through was that the clarion call is that we need to actually develop gender responsive policies, across the world. So because part of it has to do with the fact that there's a very clear consensus that COVID has not only amplified, social inequalities, but also gender inequalities. So that's really going to be, I'm going to be speaking around that area. Now, South Africa, despite all the good constitution that we have in South Africa, which is such an important critical lever for gender equality, which creates, several pathways around embedding gender budgeting. Amongst those, it's the constitutional principles on inequality, non-discrimination, but as well as a state obligation. So I'm just going to talk, jump quickly and talk about in the context of such guarantees in the constitution, but we still sit with several crises. 55.8% of Black women in this country are unemployed, disengaged, they live unproductive lives. They have no sources of income. Where 46% of South Africans who are part of the social protection system in this context, also particularly the chunk of it is around the social welfare. The female-headed households in South Africa remains poorer. Wage and income inequality is a serious issue. We are a food secure country, but a lot of households don't enjoy a food sovereignty, and they don't have access to income to be able to buy that. And obviously, they're limited income, economic opportunities. So the key question now is then, so if you have such guarantees in the Constitution, so exactly what's the problem? So the starting point, I want to start with and I really build on some of the points that Commissioner Pego was talking about around the recent budget, which I think most of the parliamentarians, you all clapped your hands when it was delivered. The first issue is that it was gender neutral, not a single mention of women in the budget, right? So already it signals that actually, this group of people who are in a majority in this country, but consistently marginalized, are actually not important, because inclusion in the budget speech indicates a political commitment. And for me, that indicates that there's a lack of political commitment, and it's a strategic error for Parliament not to even be able to pick that up. That's the first issue. And then the second issue is that we must then talk about, so what does this recent budget represent, or what it communicates? It communicates, macroeconomic objectives that the state believes that are a priority, but that may not be a priority in as far as gender equity is concerned. It communicates fiscal imbalance issues, it communicates economic growth, it communicates stimulus. But within that, there are also, issues from a gender budgeting is concerned. Is that firstly, it communicates austerity. Now, by design, more often than not, in fact, because of our macroeconomic framework, is that more often when there's austerity that are introduced in the budget, most of women-related services often get cut off. Healthcare, for example, access to education, and even economic opportunities. I think the point has been well made around, the retrenchments that we've experienced, that in fact, women are always the first to be shown the door. The other issue that this budget communicates is that it's actually going to prioritize debt over some of the domestic, pressures. The 180 billion, windfall, which came from the commodity sector, unexpected, it got channeled back into debt. And it's 180 billion that this country needs. And we are actually channeling funding that is, required for school, for healthcare, for public infrastructure, for instance, for economic opportunities. It gets channeled to a debt. So the key question, the point I want to make around this is that we are treating national budgeting as though it's a household budgeting, right? And in essence, that's why gender budgeting is actually not entrenched within the spending. The other issue I want to raise is around the theory of change, and it came quite consistent in some of the speakers that came through, that it's also vague, right? It looks at minimal commitments, even though we may seem as South Africa as a country that has embraced longitudinal planning, public policy planning. But in fact, in terms of outcomes, actually, we really look at minimalism. So the annual planning process. But part of that annual planning process, what has come out quite clear from a gender equity perspective is that it's a patriarchal-based planning system, which looks at the quantitatives. How many schools were built, how many bridges were built, how many stadiums were built, but the qualitative component are completely excluded. So in essence, we're not able to measure whether the rents and cents are actually making an impact, in this country. So that's another thing. The other issue, which is very important, is around the language of gender mainstreaming, right? Now, our budgeting, again, assumes that, we can just always add on women, instead of actually introducing, a gender-centered budgeting process, which looks at gender, which looks at class, which looks at, spatial location. So in essence, we should know if we use those three categories. I mean, even, even you can talk about, sexual orientation. If you use these four categories to allocate your resources, you'll actually know exactly where you need to allocate your resources. But as long as you still continue to do the mainstreaming component, is that we actually never going to be able to understand exactly where, because women must be the unit of planning and resource allocation. But I want to get into the gender disaggregated data. I think the FCCC have made the point, very clear. The last 3 points I want to make sure, because I want to recover a lot of time for you. So one of the key things that had also even come quite clear even during the COVID was that even our disaster risk policy, even though we might have actually 46% of women's representation in cabinet, but there's a disaster risk policy, and was so gender neutral. It made women so invisible, right? So we know the story, for example, how the parallel economy got excluded. Instead, we actually allowed, all the organized, oligopolistic markets to actually open their businesses. But women who sold tomato, who sold onion and bread, etc., were actually forced to. So immediately it signals the disconnect in actually understanding of how we take our decision. And again, I want to implore, I'm pleased that that this session is actually hosted by Parliament, because in essence, from an oversight perspective, it's a strategic error for Parliament not to have actually really have picked up. The other issue I want to raise, I think it's coming up, it's around the support for, gender justice work, right? Now, the gender justice work is also the fact that there's a lack of funding, exactly reflects the fact that in the budgeting component within, the departments, is that it's a mainstreaming. So the gender component is not embedded in the planning, but in fact it's an afterthought, and that's why we're always going to look at the extra rand and cents in terms of allocation. I mean, the support for parallel economy is minimal. I think gender-based violence has really sent a very clear message in this country that actually this is an area that we need to support. And at the same time, we can even take some of the resources that the police is unable to utilize. Police committee appeared before the committee, police ministry appeared before the committee in January. I mean, they've not spent almost 2 billion, and they can't account why they've not spent in 2 billion, when in fact, women are walking in fear in this country. Again, that's where the issue of gender budgeting is actually not entrenched, because if it was, actually the police would know that we could use some of this 2 billion to deal with issues of DNA testing, which currently we're sitting with 117,000 backlog of women who have been raped, but whom they've not had access to justice. So you would know that access to, justice delay means that there's a lack of access to justice. 2 more points. I think the issues around industrial policy. There's something very fundamental that we need to really deal with this in this country, is that we seem to be making a political choice of spending between 30 to 50% of our GDP spending on social policy instead of industrial policy. And in essence, consistently, we're going to talk about the issue of limited economic opportunities, while in fact, we only give 8% of our GDP to industrial development. So it's quite clear that we're building a society of citizens who must remain in the safety net of a safety net of a public sector, instead of investing in citizens who should lead productive lives, women who will have access to opportunities, women who are going to earn fair wages, and women whose unpaid social reproductive work is actually going to be recognized. If we don't call for shifting of resources when different committees are appearing before the portfolio committee, it means that we're going to consistently spend so much money or sit with even more 50 to even 80% of South Africans actually sitting on the social protection. And that actually creates social instability, because citizens do require, to lead an independent life from the system. At the last point already, the young people of this country, 77.82% are disengaged, unemployed, lead unproductive lives. And it's a social instability on its own, because it means that you have a generation of younger people who are going to grow up and become adults who have not been intellectually engaged, but also who have no output that they've given to society. And it means that it's actually going to be a future crisis when all of us in this room are frail and old and absolutely have no political voice in society, and we're going to be governed by young people who have not been engaged by the system, but also who've not been active either in labor market or leading a productive life. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Mayor. I realize the pressure you were under to deliver. You have delivered. There's no doubt about it. And we will read your presentation. Don't worry. And we have a hotline to you. I'm sure you will be available to us when we need you back. Honorable Kate Bilankulu, the chairperson of the multi-party caucus, please speak to us. You too, Mayor. Try and make it as brief as you can. You have no, what's the word, a chance of not complying with the time requirements. Thank you.
Oh, Deputy Speaker. Oh, no, I will try my best.
Okay.
I will. No, thank you very much for the opportunity. The two program directors, the Deputy Chairperson of the NCOP, Honorable S.E. Lucas, the Deputy Speaker of the National Assembly, Honorable S.L. Zinoli, the Chapter 9 institutions, speakers of the legislatures, ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. Dimasiari Inhlika. Chairperson, before I start with my deliberations, I would like to take this opportunity to remember women and girls who died because of the GBV. May their souls rest in peace. And I will also want to pledge the support to the Ukrainian that are getting it tough now, and to say to them that they are in our prayers. In addressing the state of gender mainstreaming, first I would like to start by saying that my presentation today is informed by the UN definition of gender mainstreaming. The UN defines gender mainstreaming as the process of assessing the implication for women and men of any planned action, including legislation, policies, or programs in all areas at all levels. As the above definition implies, the primary objectives of gender mainstreaming is to institutionalize gender equality by pushing in gender-sensitive practices in all structures and processes, including the environment of institutions. This is in line with the principles of our Constitution, which afford equal status for both women and men. The commitment to achieve gender equality has led to adoption of various gender mainstreaming institutional frameworks and mechanisms. And one of those frameworks is the National Gender Policy Framework, herein referred after as Gender Policy Framework. Coming to the issue of the state of gender mainstreaming, I would like to pose the following questions. If, as a country, we have adopted mechanisms aimed at transforming our institution to realize gender equality, what have we achieved so far? Where have we failed, and what is the way forward? Let me start with our successes. We didn't achieve all, but I'm happy to pronounce that we are amongst the best countries as South Africa. As a country, we have registered some success that we can boast about, and this includes the government has adopted a transformation agenda and set a target of 50% representation for women at all levels of the senior management service through Employment Act, Equity Act. The establishment of a ministry responsible for women, children, and persons with disabilities, mandated to champion the advancement and promotion of gender equality. This ministry has, amongst its initiatives, developed a framework for gender responsive planning, budgeting, monitoring, evaluation, and auditing. Gender responsive planning and budgeting is about institutionalization of gender mainstreaming across public services. For the first time, the National Treasurer has provided technical guidelines for certain departments to include gender policy priorities, outcome indicators, and targets. Establishment of multi-party women caucus in national, provincial, and municipal legislatures. The National School of Government, including training modules on gender mainstreaming for public services officials. The increase in number of women participation and represented in politics. Removal of VAT from sanitary pads and provision of free sanitary products by some provincial governments. Government has committed that at least 40% of all government expenditure to be set aside for women-owned businesses. Despite the registered successes and the availability of various mechanisms for gender mainstreaming, we as the country we have not met the 50% target for women representation in SMS, as women are overrepresented in low income and low levels of employment. There are no significant women empowerment programs. Appointed gender focal points are not effectively located to influence planning and budgeting, while some institutions have not appointed any gender focal unit. The African female-headed households are the poorest. women still have burdens of unpaid care work. We still experience instances of gender pay disparities. We have high rate of gender-based violence and femicide. Majority of victims are women. COVID-19 has brought the existing inequalities to the forefront and has led to more marginalization of women. There are various reasons why we as the country have not achieved the desired gender equality, and these include the lack of implementation of gender equality prescripts. It is very important for government institutions at national, provincial, and local levels to understand that it is their responsibility to implement gender equality prescripts. Government institutions need to understand that gender mainstreaming should focus on both internal and external clients for gender equality to be realized. Another reason we have not been able to achieve desired gender equality as this country is because of lack of adequate oversight by structures mandated to do so. As legislatures, we need to take responsibility for failing to hold institutions to account about implementation of gender mainstreaming initiatives. Our oversight endeavors have fallen short, and we fail to ask institutions to provide us with the gender disaggregated data and information, proof of integration of gender into daily activities of institutions, clearly identified and executed gender planning, and how need of both genders inform planning, development, and resource allocation. Proof of full participation of women in decision-making process. On the role of the Women's Caucus, multi-party women caucuses are established as gender focal structures in national, provincial, and local legislature to ensure gender responsiveness in the legislative sector for both internal and external clients. The role of multi-party women caucus is to bring together all women parliamentarians across party political lines and in partnership with other stakeholders to advocate for gender equality within and outside legislatures. The multi-party women caucus members have multiple membership in various parliamentary committees. This can be utilized to ensure that individual members intensify oversight measures over gender mainstreaming in various government departments. As a collective, currently in all our engagement with departments, we ask information about programs in place in each department aimed at promoting women's empowerment and gender equality and transformation. During the course of the year, we are planning engagement with provincial and municipal women's caucuses about gender-based violence and femicide. This will also help us identify provinces and municipal councils who have not established multi-party women caucuses. We will then assist and support women parliamentarians in those areas with establishment of women caucuses. I would like to conclude as follows, Deputy Speaker.
Thank you.
Gender mainstreaming will only happen when there are effective mechanisms in place, which includes political will and buy-in, effective implementation of policies and effective oversight. And also such, I would like to recommend as follows. I believe that we need to take stock and get a true reflection of our gains and challenges, and relevant key government institutions must be afforded a platform to provide updated and comprehensive report on current state of gender mainstreaming within public service and their plans to address identified challenges that have hindered progress. Getting current feedback from key stakeholders is to ensure that we are putting forward effective recommendations that do not refer to what is currently being addressed, by the stakeholders. An example for emphasis, the Department of Women had planned to undertake a process of assess and review the national gender machinery, and as such, may have come up with a diagnosis report and policy recommendation on how to enhance national gender machinery and structures as detailed on the gender policy framework. Another example to cite is in my argument for getting update from
don't make examples, please. Wrap up. I thought you were wrapping up. Now you're making additional examples. You've made a point. Don't exemplify it. We've had you,
okay.
And we will read
Okay,
your speech. Thank you very much.
I also believe that reviewing available policies and laws when there is a need is a good thing to do. But if implementation, oversight, and accountability challenges are not addressed, they will be carried over to the reviewed policies. The legislatures need to come up with own mechanism to ensure that adequate oversight over gender mainstreaming is adopted by all parliamentary committees and not be left to women committees only. Chairperson, I quote, "Take a lesson from the ants, you lazy bones, learn from their ways and become wise. It has no commander, no overseer, no ruler, yet it stored its provision in summer and gathers its food at harvest." Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Honorable. Yes, let's move to Honorable Matlopa, the chairperson of the Premier's Portfolio Committee of the Women's Caucus in KZN. Honorable Matlopa, tell me. Is Honorable Matlopa on the platform? Sibulelo, is Honorable Matlopa on the platform? Are you seeing her?
Deputy Speaker, she's not on the platform at the moment, but she was
No,
on
let's
earlier.
proceed. Let's proceed.
Okay.
Let's proceed and give to the Executive Director of Sonke Gender Justice to summarize his presentation as well. Isikhathi sidliwe inja, siyaxolisa. Please go ahead, Ntate Kumar.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker, Honorable Session Chairperson, Honorable S.E. Lucas, and all protocols observed. Thank you very much for including the voice of civil society on this important consultation. We meet at a critical time, both in our country, in our region, and globally. Let's spare a thought for women in conflict settings. As we all know, where there is conflict, women are always caught in the crossfire. In South Africa, we're still reeling from the harsh effects of COVID-19, which evidence shows impacted heavily on all, but even more on women, as our economy was hard hit. All the more reason why this consultation is critical. It has exposed the high poverty levels and disparities in our geopolitical landscape, despite progressive legislation. As we consider introducing the amended policy to guide the work of the gender machinery, we take into account these challenges. The Gender Policy Framework of 2000 laid an important foundation for coordinating the gender transformative work in our country. There are a lot of lessons learned from that era, as eloquently outlined by the chair of the CGE in her presentation earlier today. By and large, we are ourselves within the proposals espoused by the CGE and align ourselves with many of those recommendations. What is key for us as civil society is that this policy must ensure that it creates an environment for a creative multi-stakeholder engagement geared towards advancing the cause for gender transformation in all spheres of state organs, nationally, provincially, and at local level. In the last policy, the role of civil society was not clearly defined. This needs to be addressed in the new intended to be amended policy. As civil society, we are already engaged in numerous programs that seek to advance gender mainstreaming in various platforms in our country. The challenge for us is that most of the work that we do is not funded. Most civil society organizations are funded on the main by global philanthropy, and to a limited extent, there is a growing possibility of funding by corporates in our country for civil society, especially in the work of the gender-based violence and femicides and HIV interventions. But more support is required, especially for community-based organizations in rural and in informal settlements of our country. I need to make the point that as civil society, we strongly feel about the need to hold duty bearers accountable for the work they have committed themselves to do. This, in many instances, is a sticky point, particularly from government side. Often, our engagement on accountability standards is misconstrued as being oppositional. Nothing can be further from the truth. Accountability is a useful value for all of us. We ourselves, as civil society, are held accountable for our work by communities that we work with, by the legislation governing civil societies, by organizations that are providing resources for us to do the work that we are doing. We welcome this because it is the right thing to do. All those who receive public funds must account for how these are utilized to ensure that those that are providing the funds are satisfied that the work that has been promised is being done. Our primary interest, therefore, is to collaborate with government and ensure that it succeeds in implementing its commitments to the people. When this happens as civil society, we will support it. But where there are failures, we will not hesitate to call government out. The record shows itself that South African civil society is not irresponsible in engaging duty bearers. There are numerous examples of collaboration, including providing capacity training where there are challenges. This we do because we are invested in seeing our state organs achieving their goals and registering positive results that advances people's lives in our country. One of the challenges we pick up on the ground is policy incoherence or disharmony. This we observe where we have progressive legislation advancing the transformative agenda on the one hand, but this is negated by other legislation that contradicts these positive elements, e.g., legislation on land transformation. Very progressive, but you also find legislation that is proposed around traditional leadership, which negates these advances that are promoted by other legislation. We need to find harmony as we develop these laws so that we do not create two South Africas, one where women can have access to all the rights, but other women have to go through other systems because of their location geographically. Let me conclude by saying, Chair, we need to buttress this comprehensive process by ensuring that we advance the discussion around the gender equality and women's empowerment legislation, which was placed on your agenda and was withdrawn without concluding. Because we think unless we have a very clear gender equality and women's empowerment legislation, whatever the gender machinery does will fall flat if it does not address some of the issues that have been raised by my colleagues who have spoken before me, particularly my colleague from Oxfam, because these are issues that we need to harmonize on ensuring that we don't only speak progressive language around transformation, but do not put resources where this transformation needs to be taking us. And if we do that, we will be able to register the goals that we want to see our country advancing to. Thank you very much, Speaker.
Thank you, Bafana. Thank you very much. Much appreciated. We regret that Honorable Madlopa was not able to connect. Is she still not present? If she's not, let's go to Professor W. Domingo, Commissioner of the South African Law Reform Commission. Please speak to us, Prof.
Good afternoon, Deputy Speaker, honourable members, colleagues, friends. Chair, I'm going to be very short, so I'm going to be your good timekeeper today. I will keep it very, very short. And the reason for this, colleagues, is that, as you know, the commissioners of the South African Law Reform Commission, we're not full-time commissioners. So, Chair, I wish to say that we have not had the opportunity as a commission to go through the gender policy framework. We will provide comments as the commission itself. However, I will speak today around the work that the commission does around law reform that perhaps intersects and provides some of the gaps and focus areas that we need focus on in this gender mainstreaming or in the gender policy framework. What I'm going to speak to today really deals with the issues of law reform in the area of family law. And if we think about women, that's the heart of where many of them don't have access to justice despite legislation. So one of the things that we want to do is to reform law in order to provide women that access to justice. But what we've heard today is it's also all about implementation. So, Chair, some of the projects that we are working on is a review of the law of maintenance. Now, this is very important because while we have legislation that regulates maintenance, if women are not getting their maintenance, that affects them economically. It affects their power to engage in society as well. So this project is dealing with the review of the Maintenance Act of 1998, specifically looking at the implementation and enforcement of maintenance orders. One of the other projects that we are also dealing with is a review of the aspects of the Matrimonial Property Act. So for those of you that don't know, the Matrimonial Property Act was passed in November 1984. And there have been, so it's been in operation for almost 30 years, but there are many gaps within that policy. We now have the Constitution, we have the recognition of customary marriages, we have the recognition of civil unions. The underlying aim of this investigation is to review the current law with regard to matrimonial property for greater legislative fairness and justice governing interpersonal relationships between spouses. And this is very important. So while a woman may have economic power, once she enters into that marriage and she doesn't regulate her matrimonial property correctly, she could lose half of that to a husband if they're married in community of property, and many things can go wrong once that marriage is dissolved in terms of her matrimonial property and also her assets. The other project that we're working on is the Single Marriage Act, and there has been, we're working with the Department of Home Affairs on this. The Department of Home Affairs has issued policy around calling for a single marriage. The Law Reform Commission is investigating the recognition of a single marriage registration. So it doesn't matter what marriage you have, you can register your marriage as well as a life partnership. We have issued a bill around this, and it's called the Protected Relationships Bill. What we want to do is protect all intimate relationships. And this is also very important for the empowerment and equality of women. And then one of the other big projects that we are dealing with is the Family Law Dispute Resolution Bill. The object of this is to ensure access to justice to the vulnerable within our society. So to give you just a brief background on the statistics, only 35% of children live with both biological parents. Think about that. Within families, only 35%. 58% of children are born to unmarried mothers. 80% of parties to a family dispute are unrepresented. And 55% of divorces in our country involve children. So there's a dire need for women to have access to justice. Now, access to justice is not necessarily having access to courts. What the Law Reform Commission is saying is we need women to have access to justice in an effective, efficient way that does not cost a lot of money. To go to court, to get an attorney, and to have an advocate costs money. So we're thinking and wanting to have almost I want to say an ideological shift in understanding what access to justice means. And that can include alternative dispute resolutions, which is mediation. So mediation, what we're calling for is compulsory mediation in family law issues. One of the other projects that we're also dealing with is relocation of families. So this is a situation where mom, dad is divorced and one party leaves the country and they want to take the child with. And that has huge implications for the children in our country, as well as parties wanting to move to other countries. I've heard today that many people raise the issue of gender-based violence. What I would like to say to colleagues present here today is that the Law Reform Commission, and one of the projects that I am looking at, deals with looking at domestic violence as a criminal offense. What we have right now in our country is you can have a protection order, but it is not a criminal act. So in other words, a woman would get an interdict if there is a situation of domestic violence. She uses the Domestic Violence Act. What we are investigating is determining whether we can make domestic violence in and of itself a crime in South Africa. And we want to include strangulation in that. So I don't have the time to go into that, but strangulation is a huge thing in our country in terms of gender-based violence in our country. So, Chair, that was a quick summary of everything that we are doing. And some of the issues that's focusing on women. But as my parting words, what I do want to say is that access to justice is very important, but implementation is essential. Resources to the police, to the courts, to the family advocate's office is important if we want to make these laws a lived reality for women's lives. Thank you.
Thank you very much for illustrating that it can be brief and still be substantial. Thank you very much.
Chair.
I really appreciate your insights there. I think what we are now going to do quickly, because we don't have time anymore left, but we cannot give a few people an opportunity in a word or two to comment or raise a question briefly, without too many preambles. Please do that. I was illustrating lowering, or what's the word, upping your hand and lowering it now. Please do so. Yes, please raise your hands and let's hear. Who wants to start? Who's got a question or a brief comment?
Possibly, I didn't see you.
Chaba, please go ahead.
Okay.
Others will follow.
Can you hear me?
Yes, clearly, please go ahead.
I would like to find out, because under the Domestic Violence Act, there is emotional, psychological, and financial abuse. Why, when a woman goes to court or magistrate court to report such instances and they are not taken seriously, don't you think maybe Department of Justice or the Commissioner can actually let us know how can people be educated together with the law enforcement to assist people when it comes to that, because the emotional abuse.
No, I think you've made a very good point. I think we've picked it up. Thank you very much. The panelists will each make a point about it. Let's go ahead to the next question. Any next question? I'm not seeing any question coming up. You know what? I think what we might do, Deputy Chairperson, here's Jackie Mpondo Hendricks. Please go ahead and be brief. Yeah.
Yes, thank you so much for the opportunity. I just wanted to, as you see, my name is Jackie Mpondo Hendricks. I'm the CEO of the South African United Business Confederation. I look forward to a day when business will also become part of this conversation, especially because the work ecosystem has completely changed also due to COVID. So I'm looking forward to that day when we will be included in these stakeholder engagements.
Okay. Thank you very much. That's a good, quick comment. Yes. Snekaya George, please speak to us. Snekaya.
Yes, sir. Hello.
Please go ahead.
Okay, so there's an act that says Violence Against Women Act of 1994, September 13. Does the South African people use that act? If South Africans are using that act, what are the precautions that are taken against to make that women are not being violated?
Okay. All right. Thank you. In the absence of any other question, I would like to give to panelists, I would like to say the following things. Firstly, we really appreciate the insights that we have received from an international assessment of where support can come, where useful experiences are emerging from. And we have been given a bit of it by the UNDP head there. But also the other presenters have also taken a slice of a critical part of what we are debating to give us insights that are very useful, that needs following up and further discussions. And what I also like is reference to the oversight. In addition to the high-level panel that was asked to evaluate legislation, so that we determine what's wrong with its efficacy. Was it the policy? Was it the law itself? Was it institutions? Was it public education by officials and so on? Or was it budget strangulation, if I may put it crudely that way? So those questions were important. But the next iteration is an oversight summit, which I know the Speakers Forum is planning and is coming around June. It was meant to be in March, has been postponed. So some of the things you have already referred to that make sense for evaluation of the impact of the work we are doing and the oversight that can be improved on what is already taking place will be a huge difference. So some of your insights will contribute towards that. I just want to suggest that the president, in replying to the State of the Nation debate, cited a reference by the deputy chair to gender-sensitive budgeting. And I think that's the political statement which budgets must respond to. That perhaps the budget did not, must mean that the political must prevail over the budgeting. It's a resource allocation, it's a resource reconsideration that must always inform pursuing what has been presented as the political direction given by the president on behalf of cabinet. We will look at those things intensely, but let me give over to the deputy chair to proceed and perhaps give the the panelists, those who are able to do so, in a word or two to respond, including responding to questions that have been posed. Deputy Chair, can I pass it on to you?
Thank you, Honorable Deputy Speaker. I want to just say to the participants, unfortunately, what happened in the morning have really eat in on our time. And it is actually, we are not doing justice to this final part of the event, but we were immediately saying we were supposed to have a few engagements on the Women's Charter review, and there is supposed to be a sector-wide planning session, and I think that will give us an opportunity to engage more on the issues that have been raised here. But before we conclude, let us give to Honorable Fanta. I'm sure you will not disappoint me if I say I'm just giving you 3 minutes to make an input, because also you are part and parcel of the team that is responsible for oversight. And I'm sure as a chairperson of a multi-party women's caucus in the Eastern Cape, you will be able to also assist with the issues that have been raised. Honorable Fanta.
Good afternoon, Chairperson. Thank you, Deputy Chair. My name is Fanta from Eastern Cape. Am I audible?
You are so audible, sis.
Oh, thank you. No, let me appreciate the wonderful inputs from different presenters. It's a mouthful and we highly appreciate. For me, as chairperson of the Women's Caucus, I really need a synergy of how we do these things of the gender agenda, especially with the Women's Caucus leading us. We thought that by this time she will be visiting provinces or call us as a chairperson of Women's Caucus, so that to have a common understanding and a common role on how we do things as standing committees. Because in province we are standing committees, we are not doing oversight. We are doing oversight through special programs that it is the portfolio committee, and we are managing to make impact of doing oversight through that. But Women's Caucus is vocal, especially on gender issues, especially on gender-based violence issues. But because we don't have directions from national and on how we are working in also in other provinces, how I wish that as a chairperson of the Women's Caucus at NA, she could arrange a meeting for all of us, so that we are given a line of march that is the same. The issue of gender, ifuna all of us together. But I like the presentation, especially the one of the last one. That one is so powerful, and women, that's where they're getting problems. The issue of marriages, the single parent, the kids, that we really need workshops in various provinces, in various districts, because our women are victims of the laws of their marriages. They get in marriages without understanding. When they want to get out, it's difficult.
As you conclude.
Thank you, Chairperson.
Thank you very much. Just before I give over to the Deputy Speaker to do the closing remarks, I also just want to recognize the leadership of the ANC Women's League. They've been with us throughout, and I also want to express my appreciation for the support that they've been given, together with the Progressive Women's Movement of South Africa, to us in the process of the review of the Women's Charter. And I don't know whether I would be allowed, but I would have loved possibly if the President or the Deputy President have also just a small input that they can make on behalf of the constituency that they represent. 3 minutes. I will allow.
Thank you very much, Comrade Sylvia and Comrade Lechisa and many other comrades that are here. We highly respect the process we have started, and we commit ourselves to working together with all other women's organizations to ensure that for us as the Women's League, when we go to the policy conference of the ANC, we bring up a lot of issues that have been brought up here that are going to assist us towards the implementation of our demands. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Comrade Bata, as the president of the ANC Women's League, for your input. I don't know whether there is someone from the Progressive Women's Movement that is here that can also just raise one issue as a multi-party structure, because you were also very, very instrumental in assisting us to be able to be where we are today, or the Progressive Women's Movement. If there is no one, we will give to the Deputy Speaker to do the closing remarks. I can promise all of the delegates and the participants here today. So as soon as we are back from constituency period, we will call that planning session, and we will once again get some of the presenters here, because I am particularly interested in the one from the Commissioner of the Planning Commission as well as the FFC. And Professor Domingo, we had a law reform workshop before. We need really, it's a fact what Honorable Fanta have said. Remember the issue of the customary law. Just after we had the session with you, there was a big debate in the country around the issues of customary legislation, and you have really empowered us at that moment to be able to participate in that debate. So to all the new role players, stakeholders, not that you are new as in new, but during the process, we've been working very closely with UNDP, with FFC, with Gender Commission, with the Law Reform Commission, as well as with the Stats SA. And now we have the civil society and private sector partners, and we are ever expanding, and we are really, really appreciative of the inputs and the kind of information that we get from you. But we will give to the Deputy Speaker to do the closing remarks. We are all, the NA as well as NCOP, are having plenaries at 2, but we will make sure we keep the record and the information is available all the time to all of you. We've got a very good communication section at Parliament, and they make sure that they record all the inputs, presentations, and things that we are busy with. And they are also making sure that, for instance, I don't know how we will inform you, but this will definitely be broadcasted on the parliamentary channel as soon as there is a slot. Then I think members can also follow up there. Over to you, Deputy Speaker, for the closing remarks. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Deputy Chair. And we really appreciate as you have already said, all the delegates' participation. By merely sitting and listening, that's a great contribution. No meeting, no conference occurs without people who have ability and attention to listening. That's a big contribution. Otherwise, what is said by anybody else, our special guests today, would not have had any audience. So this is especially for us to appreciate that. Secondly, that this is ongoing work of what myself and the Deputy Chair are responsible for partly. In other words, the sectoral work, but it has interconnections with a whole range of things, including, for example, in the nature of the transformation of the economy, which is the subject of the economic cluster, but there are social consequences. So the social transformation itself is critical in its interaction with the public to ensure that we are sensitive to what people are asking. People who have been invited here constitute leadership. And so we assume that we are talking to leadership, and they are here in their representative capacity, and they will take what we are saying here and share it with people they represent in the various sectors that we come from. It's an important part of process of consultation and so on. We also undertake, for example, inside the legislative sector as a whole, to improve the quality of our communication and information dissemination and soliciting views to always be part of the process that we are taking. The Speakers Forum meets quarterly, and so we often have an opportunity to share experiences of what's happening in each of our provinces around some of these issues. So that coordination is important to deepen the level of coherence and strength of what we are doing. We do like the concrete experiences, the lived experiences that we do get from presenters here as a result of the specific work they do. It throws light that policies cannot be cast in stone. They must be reviewed in the light of evidence that is emerging that they are not producing the results they are intended to do. We can't not be recognizing what must continue and what must change as a result of COVID-19 was referred as one of the difficulties that is currently dominating considerations. But the levels of quality of poverty, inequality, and unemployment, for example, and the social reproduction crisis that Mepeko spoke about, the inability of people to make a living effectively, are serious conditions that has to mean something to policies and their implementation so that when we review, we have taken on board those matters equally. So thank you very much for your contributions. We really appreciate the work that went into the preparations that was shared with us today. We will magnify them by sharing them with others who could not come here. We targeted 120 people. Those of you, roughly 78 to 80, who were present, some in and out, was a good audience. We appreciate it. Thank you very much. And see you next time in other platforms, either on the virtual platforms and or in mask-to-mask interactions. Thank you very much. And thank you to you, Deputy Chair, for the leadership and consistent work with us around this sector. Thank you very much. We have to go and join the houses now.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker, and to the person that wrote on the chat group that we must please confirm that this is an ongoing process. It's definitely an ongoing process. We've started in 2019 November, and we are still busy. So it is definitely an ongoing process. And I wanted to say, Deputy Speaker, yesterday in the international platform, we only got 4 minutes for our presentations, for everything. It's only 4 minutes. So we've given time, although I think 4 minutes didn't do justice to what we are supposed to do, but international, they don't play with us. They give us 4 minutes. All the best.
Okay.
Thank you. Thank you.
No, thank you very much. Take care.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you, Professor Domingo.
Thank
Thank
you.
you. Bye.
Recording stopped.
Sure.